Harry Potter could have left. The thought came to him most mornings now, unbidden and insistent, as he dressed in the half-light of dawn. He could have packed his trunk, walked out of the castle, and disappeared into the Muggle world, where no one knew his name or expected him to save anyone. It would have been temptingly easy. But something always pulled him back. The memory of his parents, perhaps, or simply the weight of what Dumbledore had told him about love being the magic Voldemort could never understand. This particular morning, as October rain drummed against the dormitory windows, Harry found himself thinking not about leaving, but about staying, about the strange comfort of watching Ron's sprawled form across the room, listening to Neville's soft snores, feeling utterly ordinary in a way that happened so rarely now. Third year was supposed to be different, better, and in many ways it was, except for the dreams. They came every night now, not the usual nightmares of green light and his mother's screams, but something else entirely. Dreams where he stood in a cottage he'd never seen but somehow recognized, where he heard voices he should have known, speaking words he could never quite remember upon waking. Dreams where everything felt possible and wrong at the same time, as if the world itself were holding its breath. Harry rubbed his forehead absently, tracing the lightning bolt scar that had been aching more frequently lately. He'd mentioned it to Hermione once, but she'd launched into such a detailed analysis of possible magical resonances and stress-induced phantom pain that he'd quickly changed the subject. Some burdens, he was learning, were easier to carry alone. The common room was nearly empty when he made his way downstairs, save for Hermione hunched over a pile of books at their usual table near the fire. She looked as if she hadn't slept much either, her hair even more unruly than usual, and dark circles shadowing her eyes. A cup of coffee sat cooling beside her, forgotten in her intense focus on whatever text had captured her attention. "You're up early," Harry said quietly, settling into the chair across from her. Hermione glanced up, startled, then offered him a tired smile. "I could say the same about you, though I suppose neither of us has been sleeping particularly well lately." It was true. Between Harry's dreams and Hermione's increasingly demanding schedule, she was taking more classes than should have been physically possible, though she refused to explain how. Neither of them looked particularly rested these days. Ron had stopped commenting on it weeks ago, though Harry sometimes caught him watching them with a worried expression. "What's got you so absorbed this morning?" Harry asked, nodding toward the books scattered across the table. Hermione hesitated, her fingers drumming against the leather cover of what looked like an ancient text. "Time magic," she said finally. "Specifically the theoretical limitations of temporal manipulation." Harry felt something cold settle in his stomach. That sounds specific, and possibly dangerous. "Everything's dangerous if you think about it too hard," Hermione replied, but her attempt at lightness fell flat. She pushed the book toward him, her finger marking a particular passage. "Look at this. According to Wilkins's Temporal Mechanics and Magical Theory, the Ministry's 5-hour limitation on time-turner use is presented as an absolute magical constant. But then I found this." She pulled out a different book, this one so old the title was barely visible on its spine. Adalbert Waffling's Magical Theory from 1794. He describes temporal magic as having no inherent limitations beyond the caster's magical strength and mental fortitude. The 5-hour restriction isn't mentioned anywhere. Harry stared at the pages, the words blurring slightly as exhaustion tugged at his vision. Maybe Waffling was wrong? Or maybe they learned more about time magic over the centuries? That's what I thought at first. Hermione's voice carried the particular intensity it got when she was working through a complex problem. But then I started looking at Department of Mysteries publications, research papers, anything I could find about official magical policy regarding time travel. And Harry, the 5-hour limitation was instituted in 1899, 18 years after a massive temporal disaster caused by an unspeakable named Eloise Mintumble. The name meant nothing to Harry, But something in Hermione's tone made him lean forward. What kind of disaster? She went back 5 days, Hermione whispered, her eyes wide with the implications. 5 days, Harry, not 5 hours. And according to the official report, she was found nearly dead from the experience. But she survived long enough to report that the magic itself wasn't what nearly killed her. It was the psychological strain of existing in 2 timelines simultaneously. Harry felt that familiar cold sensation spreading through his chest. So the 5-hour limit is artificial, Hermione finished. A bureaucratic restriction designed to prevent people from doing what Mintumble did, not a magical law. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the implication settling between them. Outside, the rain had intensified, and Harry could hear other students beginning to stir in the dormitories above. Soon the common room would fill with the comfortable chaos of breakfast preparations and morning complaints about assignments. This moment of quiet discovery would be lost in the mundane rush of another school day. "Why are you researching this?" Harry asked quietly. Hermione's hand stilled on the book pages. "I've been having thoughts about the time-turner Professor McGonagall gave me, about what it could do if the limitations weren't what we think they are." Thoughts about what? But before Hermione could answer, the portrait hole swung open and Professor McGonagall herself stepped through, her usual composed expression marred by what looked suspiciously like worry. She paused when she saw them, her eyes taking in the books spread across the table with unmistakable recognition. "Miss Granger," she said carefully, "I trust you're not pushing yourself too hard with your studies?" "Of course not, Professor," Hermione replied, but her voice carried a note of defensiveness that made Harry glance between them sharply. McGonagall's gaze lingered on the ancient texts, and Harry caught something that might have been regret in her expression. "The time-turner is a significant responsibility, Miss Granger. I hope you understand the importance of using it only as directed." "Naturally," Hermione said, her chin lifting slightly in the way it did when she felt challenged. McGonagall nodded curtly and continued toward the stairs, but Harry heard her pause just out of sight. When her voice drifted back to them, it was pitched low enough that they had to strain to hear. "Temporal anomalies," she was saying, clearly speaking to someone else. "Small ones, but becoming more frequent. The device is being used more extensively than we anticipated." A deeper voice responded. "Dumbledore," Harry realized with a start. "Perhaps we should have been more selective in our criteria for its use." "She's responsible," McGonagall replied, but there was doubt in her voice. "More responsible than most students twice her age. But the strain is beginning to show." Harry and Hermione exchanged glances. Hermione had gone very still, her face pale in the firelight. "And the effects on the timeline itself?" Dumbledore asked. "Minimal so far. But Hermione Granger is a brilliant witch with an insatiable curiosity. I sometimes wonder if we've given her a tool that's too tempting to use as intended." Their footsteps faded toward McGonagall's office, leaving Harry and Hermione alone with the implications of what they'd overheard. Harry felt his pulse quicken, that familiar sensation of standing at the edge of something dangerous and irrevocable. "They're worried about you," he said quietly. "They're worried about the time-turner," Hermione corrected, but her hands were shaking slightly as she gathered the books. "About what might happen if someone figured out how to use it beyond its supposed limitations. Someone like you." Hermione met his eyes, and in that moment Harry saw something that made his breath catch, a reflection of his own desperate hunger for answers, for the chance to change things that felt unchangeable. "Someone like us," she said. Harry thought about his dreams, about the cottage he'd never seen, and the voices he couldn't remember, about waking up every morning with the same terrible knowledge that his parents were dead, had been dead for 12 years, and would remain dead no matter how many times he saved other people instead. "What are you thinking, Hermione?" She was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. I'm thinking that if Eloise Mintumble could go back 5 days and survive long enough to tell about it, then the Time Turner is capable of much more than attending arithmancy and ancient runes." The words hung between them like a challenge. Harry felt something shift in his chest, a loosening of the careful control he'd maintained over his most dangerous thoughts. The dreams came back to him suddenly. Not the green light and his mother's scream, but the other ones. The ones where he stood in that cottage, and everything felt possible. "How far back do you think it could go?" he heard himself ask. Hermione's eyes met his, and he saw his own desperate hope reflected there. "I don't know," she admitted. "But Harry, what if it could go back far enough to matter?" The fire crackled in the silence that followed, and Harry found himself thinking, not about leaving Hogwarts, but about arriving somewhere else entirely. Somewhere 12 years in the past, on a night when everything had gone wrong and might yet be made right. "We'd need to know more," he said carefully. "About the magic itself, about what Mintumble actually experienced, about whether it would be possible to change things without destroying ourselves in the process," Hermione finished. Harry nodded. The cold sensation in his chest had transformed into something else. Not warmth exactly, but a kind of electric anticipation that made him feel more awake than he had in months. "This is dangerous," he said. "Everything worthwhile is dangerous," Hermione replied, echoing her earlier words, but with a different intensity now. She closed the ancient text with deliberate care. "But Harry, if there's even a chance—" She didn't need to finish. Harry knew what she was thinking, because he was thinking it too, about October 31st, 1981, about a cottage in Godric's Hollow, about 2 people who had died to save him, and who might not have to stay dead. "We'd have to be careful," he said. "Research everything first. Make sure we understand what we're attempting before we attempt it." Hermione's smile was small but radiant. "When have we ever done anything without researching it thoroughly first?" Harry thought about the Chamber of Secrets, about the basilisk and the sword of Gryffindor, about all the times they'd stumbled into danger with nothing but courage and luck to guide them. But this felt different. This felt like something that required more than courage. "Where do we start?" he asked. Hermione gathered the books with renewed energy, her exhaustion seeming to lift as purpose took its place. "The restricted section has texts on theoretical temporal magic that I haven't been able to access with my current permissions. But with the Time Turner, I could attend late-night study sessions that officially never happened." The irony wasn't lost on either of them. Using time travel to research time travel. Breaking the very rules that were supposedly designed to prevent exactly what they were contemplating. "And I could help," Harry said, surprised by how much he wanted to be part of this. "I've gotten fairly good at sneaking around the castle at night." "It won't be easy," Hermione warned. "The magic involved is incredibly complex, and the risks—" "The risks of trying," Harry interrupted. "Or the risks of not trying." Hermione considered this. "Both," she said finally. "But Harry, if we could go back to that night, if we could warn them, save them, everything would be different," Harry finished. The weight of that possibility was almost overwhelming. A world where his parents lived, where Voldemort had never marked him, where he might have grown up normal and loved and unafraid. But even as the fantasy beckoned, Harry found himself thinking about the life he'd built here, about Ron and the Weasleys, about Hogwarts itself. Would those things still exist in a world where everything had gone differently? "We're getting ahead of ourselves," he said, though his heart was racing. "First, we need to understand if it's even possible." "First, we need to understand what we'd be changing," Hermione agreed, "and what the consequences might be." She stood, books tucked under her arm, and Harry followed suit. The common room was beginning to fill with early risers, and their conversation would soon be impossible to continue in private. "Tonight?" Harry asked quietly. "Tonight," Hermione confirmed. "After everyone's asleep. Meet me by the library." As she headed toward the dormitory stairs, Harry caught her arm gently. "Hermione, are we really going to do this?" She turned back to him, and for a moment she looked very young and very frightened. Then her chin lifted in that familiar gesture of determination, and she was Hermione Granger again, the brightest witch of her age, the girl who never backed down from a challenge, no matter how impossible. "I think we have to," she said simply. "I think some possibilities are too important to leave unexplored." Harry nodded, understanding completely. As Hermione disappeared up the stairs, he remained by the fire, staring into the flames and thinking about dreams and possibilities and the terrible, wonderful prospect of being able to save the people who had died to save him. The rain continued to drum against the windows, and students continued to filter into the common room, but Harry barely noticed. He was thinking about time and magic and second chances, about a cottage in Godric's Hollow and a night 12 years ago, when everything had gone wrong. Tonight, he and Hermione would begin to research whether it might be possible to make it right. The fire crackled and hissed, and Harry thought he heard something like approval in the sound, or maybe that was just hope, making itself known at last. When Ron finally appeared, rumpled and yawning and complaining about the rain, Harry managed to respond normally to his grumbled observations about the weather and their upcoming potions essay. But underneath the familiar rhythm of morning conversation, something had fundamentally shifted. For the first time since the dreams had started, Harry felt like he might be able to do something about them. The day passed in a blur of classes and assignments, but Harry found his attention drifting repeatedly to thoughts of the evening ahead. During Transfiguration, he caught Hermione's eye across the classroom and saw his own anticipation reflected there. During Defense Against the Dark Arts, he found himself studying Professor Lupin's tired face and wondering what the man might look like if he'd grown up in a world where his best friends had lived. By the time dinner arrived, Harry could barely concentrate on eating. The castle felt different somehow, full of possibilities that hadn't existed that morning. Every conversation seemed to carry extra weight. Every decision felt more significant than it should. "You're quiet tonight," Ron observed, loading his plate with shepherd's pie. "Just thinking about the defense essay," Harry replied, which was partially true. He was thinking about defense, just not the kind Lupin had assigned them to write about. Hermione caught his eye across the table and gave him the slightest nod. Tonight. After everyone else was asleep, they would begin to explore the possibility of changing everything. Harry had never wanted evening to come so badly in his life. As the great hall emptied and students dispersed to their common rooms for evening study sessions, Harry felt a familiar thrill of anticipation mixed with nervousness. He'd broken rules before, certainly, but never for something that felt this significant. Never for something that might literally rewrite history. The Gryffindor common room gradually quieted as students completed their homework and headed to bed. Harry made a show of working on his potions essay until Ron finally yawned his way up to the dormitory, then waited another hour to be certain everyone was asleep. When he finally slipped out of the portrait hole, the castle felt different than it did during his previous nighttime adventures. Heavier somehow, as if the very stones were holding their breath. His footsteps echoed more than usual in the empty corridors, and shadows seemed to stretch longer in the wand light. Hermione was waiting by the library entrance, practically vibrating with nervous energy. She held up the time turner, its golden surface catching the light. "I've been thinking about this all day," she whispered. "About what we might find, what we might learn." "Any second thoughts?" Harry asked, though he hoped she'd say no. Hermione's smile was small but determined. "Only about 100. But Harry, if there's even a chance we could save them." She didn't need to finish. Harry understood completely. Some possibilities were too important to leave unexplored, just as she'd said that morning. Together, they slipped into the library and toward the restricted section, where ancient texts held secrets that might change everything they thought they knew about time, magic, and second chances. Behind them, the castle slept on, unaware that 2 of its students were about to embark on research that could reshape the very foundations of their world. The night was full of possibilities, and for the first time in months, Harry's dreams felt like they might be within reach. The restricted section felt different at 3 in the morning. Where it usually hummed with suppressed magical energy during daylight hours, now it seemed to pulse with something darker, more ancient. Harry pressed himself against the towering shelves, while Hermione moved between the stacks with practiced efficiency, her time-turner glinting in the wand light as she pulled texts that would never officially be recorded as borrowed. "This is the 4th time we've done this," Harry whispered, though he wasn't entirely certain. Time had become slippery these past few days, blurring at the edges in ways that made him uncomfortable. "How many hours are you actually living each day?" Hermione paused, a leather-bound volume half pulled from its shelf. "I don't think about it that way anymore," she admitted. "If I stop to calculate how much older I'm getting compared to everyone else, I'll lose my nerve entirely." She pulled the book free. Temporal Paradoxes and Their Resolution, by Saul Croker, and added it to the growing pile at their feet. Harry watched her movements, noting the slight tremor in her hands that hadn't been there a week ago, the way she sometimes paused mid-sentence, as if listening to conversations only she could hear. "Hermione," he said carefully, "are you all right? I mean, really all right?" She turned to look at him, and in the wand light her face seemed older somehow, marked by experiences he couldn't share. "I'm living the same day over and over, Harry. Not literally, but I attend arithmancy, then I turn back time and attend ancient runes. Then I turn back time again and attend Muggle studies. Every day I live more hours than actually pass, and every night I come here with you to research magic that could unravel everything we think we know about cause and effect." Harry felt something cold settle in his stomach. "We could stop. If this is too much—" "No." Hermione's voice was sharp, almost desperate. "Harry, we can't stop. Not when we're so close to understanding how this could work." She gestured to the books spread across the floor, texts they'd been stealing glimpses of for nearly a week now. Ancient treatises on temporal magic, ministry reports on time travel incidents, theoretical papers from the Department of Mysteries that probably weren't supposed to exist outside of certain heavily warded offices. "Look at this," Hermione said, settling cross-legged among the volumes and opening Croker's work to a page she'd marked. "The self-consistency principle isn't actually a magical law. It's a theory. One theory among many about how time travel functions." Harry joined her on the floor, squinting at the dense text. The language was archaic and heavily technical, but he could make out enough to understand the basic argument. "So Croker thinks you can change things. Croker thinks that temporal magic exists in a state of quantum flux until the moment of intervention," Hermione explained, her voice taking on the particular intensity it got when she was working through complex magical theory. "Every time someone travels backwards, they create a new timeline branch. The original timeline continues to exist, but so does the new one created by their actions." The implications hit Harry like a physical blow. "So if we went back and saved my parents, we'd create a timeline where they lived," Hermione finished. "But the timeline where they died would still exist. We'd just no longer be part of it." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of that possibility settling between them. Harry tried to imagine it, stepping out of this reality where his parents were dead, where Voldemort had marked him, where he'd spent 11 years with the Dursleys, and into another where none of that had ever happened. "What about the people here?" he asked quietly. "Ron, the Weasleys? Everyone we'd be leaving behind?" Hermione's hands stilled on the book pages. "I don't know," she admitted. "According to Croker, they'd continue to exist in this timeline, but we'd never see them again." The cold in Harry's stomach spread, making him feel queasy and disoriented. This was the part they'd been avoiding thinking about too carefully, the cost of changing everything. "Maybe there's another way. Maybe we could come back, or—" Harry. Hermione's voice was gentle but firm. Time travel isn't a door you can walk through both ways. If we do this, if we really do this, it would be permanent. Harry stared at the ancient text, the words blurring as exhaustion and overwhelming possibility tugged at his concentration. How can we make a decision like that? How can we choose between the people we love here and the people who died 12 years ago? I don't think we can, Hermione said quietly. I think that's exactly why we need to research everything first. We need to understand exactly what we'd be attempting, what the consequences would be, what the chances of success actually are. She pulled out another book, this one so old its binding was coming apart, and opened it carefully. But Harry, if there's even a chance we could save them. She didn't need to finish. Harry knew what she was thinking because he was thinking it too. The dreams had gotten worse over the past week, more vivid and frequent. He'd started seeing faces in them, not just the green light and his mother's scream, but actual faces. His father's eyes, the same green as his own. His mother's smile, warm and loving and alive. "Tell me what else you've found," he said. Hermione's expression brightened with renewed purpose. "The most important thing is the timeline itself. The exact sequence of events on October 31st, 1981. I've been gathering information from every source I can find." She pulled out a scroll covered in her precise handwriting. "I interviewed Nearly Headless Nick about that night. He was here at Hogwarts, of course, but he remembers the general atmosphere. Everyone was terrified. Parents were pulling their children out of school. Families were going into hiding. The war felt like it was escalating towards something catastrophic." Harry leaned closer to read her notes. "What did he say about the specific night?" "He said the castle felt different, more heavily warded than usual, like Dumbledore was expecting an attack. But then, around midnight, all the defensive magic suddenly lifted, as if whatever threat they'd been preparing for had simply vanished." "Because Voldemort was defeated," Harry said. "Because you defeated Voldemort," Hermione corrected. "A 1-year-old baby somehow managed to destroy the most powerful dark wizard in generations. Nick said by morning, owls were arriving with news of victory, but no one understood how it had happened." Harry felt the familiar ache in his scar, a phantom pain that always accompanied thoughts of that night. "What about the actual events, at the cottage?" Hermione's expression grew more troubled. "That's where it gets complicated. Official records are sealed, but I've been using the time turner to eavesdrop on conversations between professors who were alive then. McGonagall and Flitwick, mostly. Sometimes Sprout." The casual way she said it made Harry's stomach clench. "You've been spying on our professors?" "Not spying, exactly," Hermione said defensively. "Just listening. And only to conversations about events that happened 12 years ago. It's not like I'm learning their secrets or anything personal." Harry wasn't entirely convinced by the distinction, but he let it go. The moral complexities of their research were becoming increasingly tangled, and they were already in too deep to start second-guessing everything now. "What did you learn?" Hermione consulted her notes again. "The timeline is clearer now. Peter Pettigrew was the Potter's secret keeper, that's confirmed. He betrayed them to Voldemort sometime in the late afternoon or early evening. Sirius Black was supposed to check on Pettigrew that night, but when he got to Pettigrew's hiding place, it was empty." "So Sirius went to Godric's Hollow to warn them?" "No," Hermione said, and her voice carried a note of tragedy that made Harry's chest tighten. "By the time Sirius realized something was wrong and reached the cottage, it was already too late. He arrived to find the building destroyed and you crying in the rubble." Harry closed his eyes, trying to push away the image her words conjured. "How long? Between when Pettigrew betrayed them and when Voldemort actually attacked? Perhaps an hour, maybe 2 at most." Such a small window. Harry felt overwhelmed by the precision required, They would need to arrive before Pettigrew's betrayal, or immediately after it, but before Voldemort acted on the information. Too early, and they'd risk being discovered before the crucial moment. Too late, and they'd be watching his parents die all over again. "There's something else," Hermione said quietly, "about the magical protections on the cottage." Professor McGonagall mentioned them in passing to Flitwick. She said Lily Potter had been researching blood magic, protection spells that would activate upon her death. "The magic that saved me," Harry said. "Yes, but Harry, she was researching it before, that night. As if she knew what was coming. As if she was preparing for the possibility that she might need to sacrifice herself to save you." The words hit Harry like a physical blow. She knew? I think she suspected, or at least she feared it enough to prepare for it. Hermione's voice was gentle, but the implication was devastating. Which means she chose to stay in the cottage that night, knowing she might die, because she believed her death could save you. Harry felt something crack open in his chest, a rawness that made it difficult to breathe. So if we save her, if we prevent her from making that sacrifice, the protective magic might not activate, Hermione finished. Voldemort might succeed in killing all three of you. They stared at each other in the dim light, the enormity of the paradox settling between them. To save his parents, they might need to allow his mother to die. To prevent his mother's sacrifice, they might doom all three of them. "There has to be another way," Harry said desperately. "Some other method of protection. Some way to trigger the blood magic without—" "I'm looking," Hermione promised. "I've found references to protection spells that activate based on love and willing sacrifice, but don't require death specifically. Ancient magic that most wizards have forgotten about." She pulled out yet another text, this one written entirely in what looked like ancient runes. "This is Sacrificial Magic and the Bonds of Love by Ignotus Peverell. It's from the 13th century, and it describes protection rituals that bind a parent's love to their child without requiring the parent's death." Harry stared at the runes, recognizing only a few symbols from their ancient runes classes. "Can you read this?" "Slowly," Hermione admitted, "and with help from translation spells. But Harry, I think this might be the key. If we could teach your parents the right ritual, if we could help them cast the protection the right way, they could both live, and I'd still be protected," Harry finished, feeling hope flicker to life in his chest. "It's possible," Hermione said carefully, "but the magic involved is incredibly complex, and we'd need to understand it perfectly before attempting anything." Harry nodded, understanding completely. They couldn't afford to get this wrong. "How long do you think we need? To research everything properly? To understand all the implications?" Hermione was quiet for a long moment, staring at the books scattered around them. "Weeks, maybe. Possibly months if we want to be thorough about it." "Months of living multiple timelines every day," Harry said, watching her carefully. "Months of using the time turner far beyond its intended limits." "I can handle it," Hermione said quickly, but there was something fragile in her voice that made Harry doubt her certainty. "Can you? Really?" He leaned forward, studying her face in the wand light. "Hermione, you're exhausted. You're losing weight. You have dark circles under your eyes. And sometimes you respond to things I haven't said yet because you're confusing different timeline loops." Hermione's hand stilled on the ancient text. "I'm fine. You're not fine. And I'm worried that we're pushing this too far, too fast. Harry, we can't stop now." There was desperation in her voice, raw and painful to hear. "Do you know what it's like, having the power to change everything and not using it? Every morning I wake up knowing that your parents are dead, knowing that you spent 11 years being abused by the Dursleys, knowing that I have a time turner that could potentially fix all of that, and I do nothing. I go to classes and take notes and pretend that's enough." Harry felt his chest tighten at the pain in her voice. Hermione, every night I dream about them, she continued, her words tumbling out in a rush. About your parents, about you as a baby, about all the ways that night could have gone differently. And every morning I wake up and they're still dead, and you still have that scar, and I still have this. She held up the time-turner, its golden surface catching the light. How am I supposed to live with that? The silence that followed was heavy with shared pain and impossible choices. Harry understood exactly what she meant, because he felt it too. The weight of potential unused, the terrible responsibility of having the power to change everything and not knowing if they should. We need help, he said finally. What? We need help, Harry repeated. This is too big for us to handle alone. Too complex, too dangerous, too much responsibility for two 13-year-olds to carry by themselves. Hermione shook her head immediately. We can't tell anyone. If word got out about what we're attempting— Not word getting out, Harry interrupted. Just someone we trust. Someone who was there that night, who might have insights we're missing. Who could we possibly tell about this? Harry was quiet for a moment, thinking. Then slowly, an idea began to form. Professor Lupin. Lupin? Hermione's voice was sharp with surprise. He was my parents' friend, Harry said, the idea gaining momentum as he spoke. He knew them personally, knew what they were like, what they would have wanted, and he understands dark magic better than almost anyone. If anyone could help us figure out how to make this work safely. Harry, we can't just walk up to a professor and announce that we're planning to violate every law of temporal magic to rewrite history. We don't have to tell him everything at once, Harry argued. We could start small, ask him about that night, about my parents, about the magical theory involved. Feel him out, see if he might be sympathetic to the idea. Hermione chewed her lower lip, a sure sign that she was considering the possibility. It would be dangerous. If he decided to report us to Dumbledore or McGonagall, then we'd be stopped, Harry said simply. And maybe that wouldn't be the worst thing. Hermione stared at him. You don't mean that. Don't I? Harry felt suddenly exhausted, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what they were contemplating. Hermione, we're talking about abandoning everyone we've ever known to save people who died 12 years ago. We're talking about magic that could kill us, or drive us insane, or unravel the fabric of time itself. Maybe we need someone to stop us before we go too far. Or maybe we need someone to help us do it right, Hermione countered. Harry, if Professor Lupin was really your parents' friend, don't you think he'd want them to be alive too? Don't you think he'd help us if he believed it was possible? The idea was seductive and terrifying in equal measure. Professor Lupin had known his parents, had loved them, fought alongside them, mourned their loss. If anyone would understand the desperate need to bring them back, it would be him. How would we approach him? Harry asked. Carefully, Hermione said. Maybe we could start with questions about the war, about what your parents were like. Get him talking about the past, see how he reacts to hypothetical questions about time travel or changing history. And if he seems receptive, then maybe we tell him about the research we've been doing. Show him some of these texts, get his opinion on the theoretical possibilities. Harry nodded slowly. It felt like a risk, but also like a relief. The burden of carrying this secret alone was becoming unbearable, and the complexity of the magic involved was clearly beyond their current level of understanding. There's something else, Hermione said quietly. Something I haven't told you. Harry's stomach clenched. What? The nightmares you've been having. The ones about that cottage, about your parents. I've been having them too. Harry stared at her. Since when? Since we started researching this seriously. Every night, Harry. I see that cottage. I hear voices I should recognize but don't. I feel like I'm standing on the edge of something enormous and terrible and necessary. The same dreams I've been having, Harry said, understanding flooding through him. I think the time turner is connecting us somehow, Hermione continued. Or maybe the research itself is. But I wake up every morning, feeling like I've been somewhere I've never been, talking to people I've never met. People who should be alive, Harry added. People who could be alive, Hermione corrected, if we're brave enough to try. They gathered the books in silence, returning them to their places on the shelves with practiced efficiency. The restricted section felt different now than it had when they'd entered, not just darker or more mysterious, but somehow expectant, as if the ancient texts themselves were waiting to see what two desperate teenagers might accomplish with forbidden knowledge and a time turner. As they made their way back through the castle corridors, Harry found himself thinking not about the risks or the moral implications, or the sheer impossibility of what they were contemplating, but about the dreams, about standing in a cottage he'd never seen, but somehow knew, about voices that felt like home, even though he couldn't remember them clearly. Tomorrow, he said quietly as they reached the portrait hole. Tomorrow? Hermione asked. We talk to Professor Lupin tomorrow, during his office hours, just to start the conversation, see how he reacts. Hermione nodded, and Harry caught something like relief in her expression. Together, Harry confirmed. Whatever we do from here, we do it together. The fat lady grumbled as they whispered the password, but swung open to admit them. The common room was dark and empty, the fire reduced to glowing embers. They climbed the stairs to their respective dormitories in silence, but at the top, Hermione caught his arm. Harry, are we really going to do this? Are we really going to try to save them? Harry looked at her. Brilliant, brave, exhausted Hermione, who was aging faster than time itself should allow, because she couldn't bear to leave any possibility unexplored, and felt certainty settle into his bones. Yes, he said simply. We're going to try. Hermione's smile was small but radiant. Good, because I don't think I could live with myself if we didn't. As Harry made his way to his dormitory, careful not to wake his sleeping roommates, he found himself thinking about Professor Lupin's tired face and gentle eyes, about what it might mean to trust someone else with their desperate plan, about the possibility that they might not have to carry this burden alone. The castle settled around them, ancient stones holding their secrets as they'd held so many others over the centuries. But for the first time since the dreams had started, Harry felt like they might be moving toward something instead of just running from it. Tomorrow they would take the next step, whatever that might lead to. Tonight, for the first time in weeks, Harry thought he might actually be able to sleep without dreaming of green light and voices he couldn't quite remember. The future felt terrifying and full of impossible possibilities. For once, that felt like hope. The plan to speak with Professor Lupin died before it could even begin. Harry woke on Thursday morning to find Hermione already dressed and pacing the common room, her face pale with barely controlled panic. The time turner hung around her neck like an anchor, catching the early morning light streaming through the windows. We can't wait, she said, the moment she saw him descending the stairs. Harry, we can't wait for conversations or careful approaches or getting anyone else involved. What's happened? Harry asked, though something in his chest already knew the answer would change everything. Hermione thrust a copy of the Daily Prophet at him, her hands shaking slightly. The headline made his blood freeze. Sirius Black spotted near Hogwarts. Dementors increase patrols. He's not just spotted, Hermione said, her voice tight with urgency. Harry, read the article. He's been seen multiple times over the past week, always at night, always near the grounds. The Ministry thinks he's planning something for Halloween. Harry scanned the article quickly, his heart sinking with each line. Multiple witnesses, increased security measures, talk of evacuating students for the holiday. They're going to lock down the school. They already are. Professor McGonagall announced new security protocols this morning while you were sleeping. No students out of their dormitories after 8 p.m. starting today. constant supervision during classes, and Harry, her voice cracked slightly. They're talking about confiscating my time turner. Temporarily, they say. But if they take it, we lose our chance, Harry finished. Our only chance, Hermione corrected. If the school goes into full lockdown, if they increase security any further, we won't be able to access the library, won't be able to prepare properly, won't be able to do anything except wait for this to all blow over. Harry stared at the newspaper, his mind racing. How long do we have? McGonagall is meeting with Dumbledore this afternoon to discuss additional security measures. I overheard her telling Flitwick that the time turner would need to be secured in the headmaster's office by tonight. The timeline was collapsing around them, all their careful planning compressed into a handful of hours. Harry felt the familiar sensation of standing at the edge of something vast and irrevocable, but this time there was no opportunity to look back. "We're not ready," he said, though even as he spoke, the words he knew they were irrelevant now. "We have to be ready," Hermione replied simply. "Harry, it's now or never. Either we attempt this today, or we accept that your parents will stay dead, and we'll never know if we could have saved them." The weight of that choice settled between them like a physical thing. Around them, the common room was beginning to fill with students heading to breakfast, their conversations a comfortable buzz of complaints about upcoming assignments and excitement about the approaching weekend. Normal problems, normal lives. "What do we need?" Harry asked. Relief flooded Hermione's face so completely that Harry realized she'd been afraid he would refuse. "Everything we've researched about protection spells, concealment charms, emergency protocols, the temporal calculations for traveling back exactly 10 years. I've checked them 17 times, but I need to verify once more. And we need to decide exactly when and where we want to arrive." "October 30th, 1981, Harry said immediately. "The day before the attack. That gives us time to find them, to warn them, to help them prepare." "But where?" Hermione pressed. "We can't just appear in the middle of Godric's Hollow. If we arrive somewhere public, if someone sees 2 children who shouldn't exist—" Harry thought about this. "Hogwarts. We arrive at Hogwarts in 1981, get our bearings, then travel to Godric's Hollow. That's assuming Hogwarts functions as an anchor point across temporal shifts," Hermione said, her voice taking on the particular cadence it got when she was working through complex magical theory. "The castle is ancient enough, and magically stable enough, that it should provide a consistent arrival point. But Harry, if we're wrong, we end up somewhere else entirely," Harry finished. "But if we're right, we have a secure base from which to operate." Hermione nodded slowly. "I need 2 hours. 2 hours to finalize the calculations, to prepare the concealment charms, to gather everything we might need." "What can I do?" "Pack light, essential supplies only. Our wands, some emergency potions, maybe a change of clothes. Nothing that would seem anachronistic in 1981. Hermione's hands were already moving, organizing the books and notes she'd accumulated over their weeks of research. "And Harry? Write a letter. A letter to Ron, to explain something. Not the truth, obviously, but something that will help him understand why we disappeared." Her voice caught slightly. "In case we can't come back." The finality of that statement hit Harry like a physical blow. They'd discussed the theoretical possibility of being unable to return to their original timeline, but hearing it spoken aloud made it real in a way that left him breathless. "We will come back," he said, though he wasn't sure if he was trying to convince her or himself. "We'll try," Hermione corrected gently. "But Harry, if something goes wrong, if we get stuck in 1981, or if the timeline changes in ways we can't predict, then we make the best of it," Harry said firmly. "We save my parents, we stop Voldemort before he can create his Horcruxes, and we live in a world where none of this ever happened." Hermione's smile was small but genuine. "That doesn't sound like such a terrible alternative, does it?" No, Harry thought. It really didn't. They spent the morning in careful preparation, their movements efficient and purposeful. Hermione worked through her calculations one final time, while Harry gathered supplies and composed a letter to Ron that managed to be both completely honest and utterly misleading. Sorry for disappearing. Gone to help someone in trouble. Don't worry about us. We'll explain everything when we can. The castle felt different as the day progressed, charged with tension and increased security. Harry counted no fewer than 6 professors patrolling the corridors during what should have been their free period, and twice they had to redirect their path to avoid aurors who were apparently conducting sweeps of the building. "They're really worried about Sirius," Harry observed, as they ducked into an empty classroom to avoid a pair of ministry officials. "They should be," Hermione said grimly. "If he really is planning something for Halloween, if he gets into the castle during a night when security is already heightened." She didn't need to finish. They both understood the implications. Whatever Sirius Black was planning, and Harry still couldn't reconcile the stories of betrayal with his own desperate wish to believe his parents' friend was innocent. It was accelerating events beyond anyone's control. "Are you sure about the temporal calculations?" Harry asked, as they made their way toward the empty common room for their final preparations. Hermione pulled out her notes, pages covered in complex mathematical formulas and magical theory. "As sure as I can be. 36 full turns of the time turner should take us back exactly 36 hours multiplied by 10, 1 decade. The magic should deposit us at Hogwarts on October 30th, 1981, at approximately the same time we depart." "Should," Harry repeated. "Magic isn't mathematics, Harry. There are variables we can't account for, possibilities we can't predict." Hermione's voice carried the weight of all their research, all the texts that had warned about the dangers of deep temporal manipulation. "But based on everything we've learned, everything we've studied, this should work." They settled into chairs by the fire, the common room blissfully empty, as most students attended afternoon classes they were currently skipping. The letter to Ron sat on the table between them, sealed and ready. Their small packs of supplies waited by their feet. The time-turner gleamed around Hermione's neck. "Last chance," Harry said quietly. "If you want to reconsider, if you think we're moving too fast." "I think we've been moving too slowly," Hermione replied. "Every day we wait is another day your parents stay dead, another day we live with the knowledge that we could have saved them and chose not to." Harry nodded, understanding completely. The weight of inaction had become unbearable, pressing against his chest like a physical thing. "What do we do if it doesn't work? If we end up in the wrong time or the wrong place?" "Then we figure it out as we go," Hermione said simply. "We've gotten rather good at that over the years." It was true. Looking back, most of their greatest successes had involved a combination of careful planning and desperate improvisation. The Philosopher's Stone, the Chamber of Secrets, even their current situation with the time-turner, they'd learned to adapt, to think on their feet, to trust each other completely. "Together," Harry said, extending his hand. "Together," Hermione agreed, taking it. She lifted the time-turner with her free hand, the golden hourglass catching the firelight. 36 turns. Are you ready?" Harry thought about his dreams, about the cottage he'd never seen but somehow knew, about voices that felt like home, about his parents, young and alive and doomed, waiting 12 years in the past for salvation they didn't know was coming. "I'm ready." Hermione began to turn the time-turner, her movements careful and deliberate. 1 turn, 2, 5, 10. With each rotation, Harry felt something shift in the air around them, a building pressure that made his ears pop and his vision blur slightly. 15 turns, 20. The common room began to waver around the edges, reality becoming fluid and uncertain. Harry gripped Hermione's hand tighter, anchoring himself to the one constant in a world that was beginning to dissolve. 25 turns. 30. The sensation intensified, becoming almost overwhelming. Harry felt as if he were being stretched across an impossible distance, his consciousness pulled in directions that didn't exist in normal space. 35, Hermione gasped, her voice distorted by whatever was happening to them. On the 36th turn, the world exploded into golden light. Harry's last coherent thought before the temporal magic swept them away was a prayer to parents he'd never known, asking them to wait just a little longer, to hold on for one more day, because help was finally coming. The transition felt like dying and being born simultaneously. Harry experienced the sensation of being unmade at a fundamental level, his consciousness scattered across time like light through a prism, every memory and emotion and thought stretched thin across a decade of existence. He was himself at 13, and 1 and 7 and 11 all at once, experiencing every moment of his life as a single, overwhelming instant. Then, abruptly, he was whole again. The first thing he noticed was that he was lying on cold stone. The second was that every bone in his body ached, as if he'd been run over by a herd of hippogriffs. The third was that Hermione was lying beside him, unconscious, but breathing. "Hermione," he croaked, his voice sounding strange and distant to his own ears. She stirred, her eyes fluttering open. "Harry? Did we?" Harry pushed himself up on his elbows, looking around. They were in what appeared to be a corridor in Hogwarts, but not quite the Hogwarts they knew. The walls were the same, the basic architecture unchanged, but there were subtle differences. Torches burned in sconces that he was certain had held magical lanterns in their time. The portraits were different too, faces he didn't recognize, clothing styles that seemed older. "I think it worked," he said, hardly daring to believe it. Hermione sat up slowly, wincing at what was apparently the same bone-deep ache Harry was experiencing. "The temporal displacement feels consistent with a 10-year jump," she said, her voice hoarse but growing stronger. "But Harry, we need to be sure. We need to confirm the date." Getting to their feet took more effort than it should have. The time travel had left them both unsteady, as if their bodies hadn't quite caught up to where their minds had travelled. Harry felt vaguely nauseous and thoroughly disoriented, like the world's worst case of motion sickness combined with jet lag. "Where are we, exactly?" Hermione asked, looking around the corridor with growing confusion. Harry studied their surroundings more carefully. They were definitely in Hogwarts, but the layout seemed different. Corridors he thought he knew led in directions they shouldn't, and doorways he was certain existed were simply not there. "I think we're on the 3rd floor," he said uncertainly. "But this section looks different from what I remember." "The castle changes," Hermione realized suddenly. "We knew that. Rooms move, staircases shift, new areas appear and disappear. It's entirely possible that the 3rd floor we know simply didn't exist yet in 1981. The implications of that were both fascinating and terrifying. They were truly in the past now, in a version of Hogwarts that predated their own knowledge of the castle by more than a decade. "We need to find out what day it is," Harry said, "and we need to do it without being seen." They moved carefully through the corridors, staying close to the walls and listening for footsteps or voices. The castle felt different at this time of day, quieter somehow, but also more alive. Magic hummed in the walls with an intensity Harry didn't remember from their own time. "There," Hermione whispered, pointing to a portrait of a stern-looking wizard in elaborate robes. "He's awake. We could ask him." They approached the portrait cautiously. The wizard looked down at them with mild curiosity, but no alarm. "Good afternoon, young ones," he said in a cultured voice. "You seem rather lost." "We are a bit," Harry admitted. "Could you tell us what day it is?" "Thursday, October 30th, the wizard replied. "Year of our Lord, 1981. Are you quite all right? You both look rather pale." October 30th, 1981. They had done it. They were actually here, in the past, one day before the night that had changed everything. "We're fine," Hermione said quickly. "Just a bit tired. Thank you." As they hurried away from the portrait, Harry felt a combination of exhilaration and terror that left him light-headed. They were really here, in the past. One day before his parents died. "Harry," Hermione said quietly, "we need to be very careful about who sees us. If anyone from this time recognizes us—" "How could they recognize us?" Harry asked. "We weren't born yet." "Well, I was, but I was 1 year old and living with my parents. But our adult selves, what we look like now, might be recognizable to people who knew us later. And if word gets back to the wrong people that 2 children who shouldn't exist are wandering around Hogwarts—" Harry understood. They were walking paradoxes now, living contradictions of the timeline. Every person who saw them was a potential threat to the fabric of reality itself. "We need somewhere safe to plan," he said. "Somewhere we can think through our next steps without risking exposure." "The Room of Requirement," Hermione said immediately, "if it exists yet." They made their way through the castle as carefully as possible, avoiding the main corridors and keeping to the smaller passages they remembered from their midnight adventures. The 7th floor felt familiar, despite the subtle changes in the castle's layout, and the stretch of blank wall where they remembered the Room of Requirement was exactly where it should be. "We need a place to hide and plan," Harry thought desperately, as they walked past the wall 3 times, "a place where no one can find us." On their 3rd pass, a door appeared. The room beyond was small and comfortable, furnished with 2 chairs, a table, and shelves lined with books about temporal magic and protective spells. A fire crackled in a small hearth, and windows showed a view of the grounds that looked subtly different from what they remembered. Younger trees, different buildings, the same mountains in the distance. "It worked," Hermione breathed, collapsing into one of the chairs. "The Room of Requirement existed in 1981. Harry settled into the other chair, finally allowing himself to process what they'd accomplished. They had traveled back in time 10 years. They were here in 1981, 1 day before the attack on Godric's Hollow. "Tomorrow night," he said quietly. "Tomorrow night, if we do nothing, Voldemort will kill my parents." "But we're not going to do nothing," Hermione said firmly. "Harry, we're here. We actually did it. Now we have to figure out how to save them." Harry looked out the window at the grounds of Hogwarts, noting the differences that marked this as a different time. Somewhere out there, his parents were alive, living and breathing, and unaware that their son from the future was sitting in a castle, planning their salvation. "We need information," he said. "Current information about where they are, what their routine is, how heavily they're protected. And we need to understand the magical protections on their cottage," Hermione added. "If Lily really was researching blood magic, if she was preparing for the possibility of sacrificing herself, we need to find another way to trigger those protections." Harry nodded. The Ignotus Peveril text they'd studied suggested it was possible. Protection spells that activated through love and sacrifice without requiring death. But they'd need to understand the magic perfectly before attempting to teach it to his parents. "How do we approach them?" Harry asked. "How do we convince 2 people we've never met that their 13-year-old son from the future is here to save their lives?" Hermione was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. "I don't think we can," she said finally. "I don't think we can approach them directly at all." "What do you mean?" "Think about it, Harry. If 2 strange children appeared on your doorstep claiming to be from the future, claiming to know intimate details about your life and your impending death, what would you think?" Harry considered this. "I'd think they were either delusional or working for Voldemort." "Exactly. And your parents are in hiding, Harry. They're terrified and paranoid and surrounded by people they can't trust. If we approach them directly, they're more likely to curse us than listen to us." The reality of that hit Harry like a physical blow. They'd worked so hard to get here, sacrificed so much, and now they might not even be able to warn the people they'd come to save. "So what do we do?" he asked. Hermione leaned forward in her chair, her expression intense with concentration. "We work around them. We find Peter Pettigrew before he can betray them. We set up circumstances that will save them without them ever knowing we were involved." "How?" "I don't know yet," Hermione admitted. "But Harry, we have advantages they don't. We know exactly when and how the betrayal will happen. We know who the traitor is. We know what Voldemort is planning, and when he's planning to do it." Harry felt hope flicker to life in his chest. "We could intercept Pettigrew, stop him from revealing their location. Or we could manipulate events so that Voldemort gets false information. Make him think they're somewhere else, entirely. Or we could make sure Sirius actually does check on Pettigrew when he's supposed to," Harry added, remembering what they'd learned about the timeline. They sat in silence for a moment, the magnitude of their task settling around them. They were two 13-year-olds attempting to outwit the most dangerous dark wizard in history, armed with nothing but future knowledge and desperate determination. "We can do this," Hermione said quietly, and Harry heard her trying to convince herself as much as him. "We have to do this," Harry replied. "There's no going back now." Outside the windows of the Room of Requirement, the sun was beginning to set over Hogwarts, October 30th, 1981. Somewhere out there, his parents were living through their last day of life, unaware that salvation had arrived from an impossible future. Harry looked at Hermione, brilliant and brave, and utterly committed to saving people she'd never met, and felt certainty settle into his bones. They would find a way. They had to. Tomorrow night, when Voldemort came for the Potter family, he would find that the future had other plans. The night bus in 1981 smelled of cabbage and anxiety. Harry pressed his face against the grimy window as the purple triple-decker careened through the countryside, watching the landscape blur past in ways that defied several laws of physics. Beside him, Hermione gripped the arms of her seat with white knuckles, her face pale but determined. "Next stop, Godric's Hollow," called the conductor, a young man with enthusiastic eyes and a conductor's cap that seemed several sizes too large. "Mind the step now. It's a right mess with all the rain we've been having." Harry felt his stomach clench as the bus shuddered to a stop. Through the window, he could see a small village that looked like something from a fairy tale. Thatched cottages with smoke curling from their chimneys, narrow cobblestone streets, gardens already preparing for winter. It was beautiful and peaceful and utterly ordinary, which somehow made it more overwhelming than he'd expected. "This is it," he said, quietly. "This is it," Hermione agreed. They disembarked carefully, their small packs slung over their shoulders, trying to look like ordinary children on some perfectly normal visit to relatives. The conductor barely glanced at them. Apparently, two young people traveling alone was unremarkable enough in 1981. Or perhaps the magical community had different standards for supervising children during wartime. The village of Godric's Hollow spread before them like a living postcard, all autumn colors and peaceful domestic routine. Witches and wizards moved through the streets with the careful casualness of people who were trying very hard to appear normal while remaining constantly alert for danger. Harry noticed how many of them carried their wands openly, how their eyes tracked movement with the hyper-vigilance of those who'd learned not to trust shadows. "It's beautiful," Hermione said softly. "It's where I should have grown up," Harry replied, and was surprised by the rawness in his own voice. They walked slowly through the village, trying to orient themselves. The main street was lined with shops that bore familiar names. Some would still exist in their own time, others had clearly been casualties of the war or simple economics. Children played in small gardens, their laughter carrying on the autumn air, but even the youngest seemed to stay closer to their homes than children probably had in peacetime. "We need to find the cottage," Hermione said quietly. "But Harry, if it's protected by the Fidelius charm, we won't be able to see it unless someone tells us where it is," Harry finished. "I know." It was one of the complications they'd discussed, but hadn't fully planned for. The Fidelius charm was one of the most powerful concealment spells in existence, making it literally impossible to find a location unless the secret keeper chose to reveal it. Peter Pettigrew was the secret keeper for the Potter cottage, which meant that unless he told them where it was, which he obviously wouldn't, they would be unable to locate the very people they'd come to save. There has to be a way around it, Harry said, though he wasn't sure if he was trying to convince Hermione or himself. Some way to detect the magic, even if we can't see through it. Hermione pulled out a small notebook she'd been carrying, filled with magical theory they'd researched. The Fidelius charm doesn't eliminate magical signatures, she said, consulting her notes. It conceals physical location and direct knowledge, but the underlying magic should still be detectable to someone who knows what to look for. And do we know what to look for? Advanced concealment magic leaves traces in the ambient magical field, Hermione explained, her voice taking on the particular intensity it got when she was working through complex theory. Distortions in the natural flow of magic through an area. If we can find a location where the magical environment feels wrong somehow, that might indicate the presence of powerful concealment charms. They began to walk through the village more systematically, trying to sense the ebb and flow of magic around them. It was subtle work, requiring them to extend their awareness beyond their immediate surroundings and feel for the deeper currents of magical energy that flowed through all wizarding communities. Godric's Hollow hummed with magic in a way that felt ancient and comfortable. Generations of magical families had lived here, their daily spells and charms layering the village in accumulated enchantment. But as they moved through the streets, Harry began to notice areas where that comfortable hum seemed to skip somehow, places where his magical senses hit something that felt like a gap, as if part of the village simply didn't exist. "There," Hermione said suddenly, stopping in the middle of a quiet residential street. "Do you feel that?" Harry paused, extending his senses. The street looked perfectly normal, a row of small cottages with well-tended gardens, nothing that seemed out of place. But magically there was something wrong, a space where his awareness seemed to slide away, a blind spot in his magical perception. "It's like trying to look at something that isn't there," he said. "That's exactly what it is," Hermione confirmed. "Harry, I think we found it. The cottage is right there." She gestured to what appeared to be an empty lot between two other houses. "But the Fidelius charm is preventing us from perceiving it directly." Harry stared at the space, trying to force his eyes to see what his magic insisted was hidden there. It was deeply disorienting, like looking at an optical illusion that refused to resolve. "They're in there right now?" "They should be," Hermione said quietly. "Your parents and baby you, living their lives completely unaware that we're standing just meters away." The weight of that realization hit Harry like a physical blow. His parents, alive, breathing, real, were mere steps away from him, separated only by magical concealment that might as well have been an impassable void. He had traveled 10 years through time to save them, and now he could stand close enough to touch their garden gate and still be unable to reach them. "This is maddening," he said, frustration bleeding into his voice. "It's protective," Hermione corrected gently. "Harry, this is why the Fidelius charm exists, to keep the people you love safe from exactly the kind of danger your parents are facing." Harry understood that intellectually, but emotionally it felt like a cruel joke, to be so close to the people he'd dreamed of his entire life, to know they were right there, and to be unable to see them or speak to them or even confirm their existence beyond the magical void that marked their hiding place. "We should observe the area," Hermione said practically. "Learn the patterns of the neighborhood, see who comes and goes, try to understand the security arrangements." They found a small cafe with outdoor seating that provided a good view of the street containing the hidden cottage. The proprietor, a cheerful witch with flour-dusted hands, served them tea and biscuits while chatting about the weather and the upcoming Halloween festivities that the village was still trying to maintain despite the war. "Lovely to see young people still getting about," she said warmly. "So many families are keeping their children close to home these days. Can't say I blame them. with all the terrible things happening. It does seem quiet, Hermione observed carefully. Oh, it is, dear. Much quieter than it used to be. Half the houses on Elm Street are empty now. Families gone into hiding or moved abroad until things settled down. The witch's expression grew troubled. Though between you and me, I sometimes wonder if things will ever really settle down again. Harry felt a chill at her words. In their timeline, the war had ended tomorrow night with Voldemort's defeat. But this woman had no way of knowing that. For her, the future stretched ahead, filled with uncertainty and fear. Are there many families still here? Harry asked. Some. The brave ones or the stubborn ones, depending on how you look at it. The witch leaned closer, lowering her voice. There's one family on that very street. She nodded toward the area they knew contained the hidden cottage. Young couple with a baby. Been keeping to themselves something fierce lately. Can't say I blame them, but it does make one worry. Harry's heart jumped. She was talking about his parents, couldn't see them due to the Fidelius charm, but could sense their presence in the abstract way that people do when they're aware of neighbors without necessarily interacting with them regularly. I hope they're safe, Hermione said quietly. Oh, I'm sure they are, dear. Young James has always been a capable sort, and his wife Lily is brilliant with protective magic. Plus they've got friends looking out for them. That black boy comes around to check on things fairly regular, and the Lupin lad stops by as well. Harry felt something cold settle in his stomach. Sirius and Remus were still checking on his parents, still trying to protect them, completely unaware that one of their own friends had already betrayed the location to Voldemort. The black boy? Hermione asked casually. Sirius, I think his name is. Handsome young man. Bit of a wild look about him. Rides one of those flying motorcycles, if you can imagine. Makes an awful racket, but you can tell he cares about his friends. The irony was devastating. Sirius, who in their timeline was imprisoned in Azkaban for betraying the Potters, was actually still faithfully trying to protect them, right up until the moment everything went wrong. The real betrayal would come from Peter Pettigrew, who was probably trusted enough to come and go from the area without attracting any notice at all. Have you seen him recently? Harry asked, trying to keep his voice neutral. Now that you mention it, no. Not for a few days. Though I did see that Peter fellow yesterday. You know, the short one with the thin hair. He seemed rather nervous about something, kept looking over his shoulder. Hope nothing's wrong. Harry and Hermione exchanged glances. Peter Pettigrew had been here yesterday, scouting the location before his final betrayal. The timeline was proceeding exactly as history recorded, building toward the catastrophe they'd come to prevent. They spent the rest of the afternoon observing the street, learning the rhythms of the neighborhood. An elderly wizard emerged from one of the visible cottages to tend his garden. A witch with a shopping basket hurried past, her cloak billowing behind her. Children played in the distance, their voices carrying on the autumn air, but the space where the Potter cottage should be remained stubbornly invisible, a void in their perception that hurt to look at directly. Harry found himself staring at it obsessively, willing his eyes to penetrate the concealment, desperate for even a glimpse of the people he'd travelled through time to save. Harry, Hermione said gently, you're going to give yourself a headache. I just want to see them, he replied, frustration and longing warring in his voice. Just once. Just to know they're really there. They are, Hermione said with certainty. The magical distortion is too strong, too localized to be anything other than a concealed dwelling with multiple occupants. Your parents are in there, Harry. They're alive and safe for now. For now. The words hung between them like a weight. In just a few hours, everything would change. Peter Pettigrew would make his choice. Voldemort would receive the information he needed. The attack would begin. As the afternoon wore on, they noticed other things. The way some of the neighbors seemed to unconsciously avoid looking toward the hidden cottage, their eyes sliding away as if guided by magic. The way magical creatures, stray cats and garden gnomes, gave the area a wide berth, as if they could sense something their eyes couldn't see. The Fidelius charm affects more than just human perception, Hermione observed, making notes in her notebook. It's creating a dead zone in the local ecosystem. Even the animals are avoiding the area. Is that normal? I don't know. The magical theory texts don't discuss the environmental effects of long-term Fidelius charms. Hermione frowned at her notes. But it might be significant. If Voldemort is as magically sensitive as the stories suggest, he might be able to detect that kind of distortion even without knowing the specific location. The thought was terrifying. Harry had assumed that the Fidelius charm would provide perfect protection until Pettigrew's betrayal. But if the magic itself was creating detectable anomalies, we need to understand the timing better, he said. When exactly will Pettigrew make contact with Voldemort? When will the attack begin? Hermione consulted her research notes again. Based on everything we learned, Pettigrew should betray them sometime this evening. Voldemort will act on the information quickly, probably within an hour or two of receiving it. So we have until tonight to figure out how to stop this. We have until tonight to figure out how to save them without destroying the timeline or getting ourselves killed in the process, Hermione corrected. As if summoned by their conversation, a disturbance in the magical atmosphere made them both look up sharply. Harry felt it first as a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn weather, a wrongness that set his teeth on edge and made his scar prickle with phantom pain. "Do you feel that?" Hermione whispered. Harry nodded, his hand instinctively moving to his forehead. The sensation was familiar from his nightmares, but magnified beyond anything he'd experienced while awake. Dark magic. Moving this way. They watched the street with growing tension, but nothing visible appeared to explain the magical disturbance. Yet the wrongness continued to build, pressing against their senses like an approaching thunderstorm. "He's not here yet," Hermione said, but her voice was tight with anxiety. "This is something else. Reconnaissance, maybe, or preparation." The feeling intensified, then suddenly faded, leaving them both breathless and shaken. Whatever dark presence had been approaching had withdrawn. But the message was clear. Voldemort was already turning his attention toward Godric's Hollow. The attack might be hours away, but the predator was already circling. "We're running out of time," Harry said. "Then we need to make our move," Hermione replied. "Harry, we can't wait any longer for a perfect plan. We have to act." Before Harry could respond, they were interrupted by an unexpected voice. "Excuse me, dears." They turned to find an elderly witch approaching their table, her white hair wild and unkempt, her robes patched and faded, but clean. She moved with the careful precision of someone very old, but still sharp, her pale eyes fixed on them with uncomfortable intensity. "Matilda Bagshot," Hermione whispered, recognizing her from the magical history texts they'd studied. "Indeed," the old woman said, having somehow heard the whisper despite the distance. "And you are two children who don't belong here." Harry felt his blood freeze. "I beg your pardon?" Matilda Bagshot settled into an empty chair at their table, without invitation, her pale eyes never leaving their faces. "Oh, I'm not going to turn you into anyone, dear boy. But you should know that when you've lived as long as I have, you develop a sense for temporal anomalies." Hermione went very still. "Temporal anomalies. Time travel leaves traces," Bathilda said, conversationally, as if discussing the weather. "Ripples in the fabric of causality that sensitive individuals can detect. You two are absolutely drenched in temporal displacement magic." The cafe proprietor approached their table with a warm smile. "Afternoon, Miss Bagshot. The usual." "Please, dear," Bathilda replied, then waited until the woman had moved away before continuing. "Now then, which future are you from?" Harry and Hermione stared at each other, panic and confusion warring in their expressions. This was the scenario they'd feared most, discovery by someone with the knowledge and capability to expose them. "I don't know what you mean," Harry said carefully. Bathilda's laugh was surprisingly warm. Oh, child, I'm 157 years old. I've forgotten more about magic than most wizards ever learn, and I've been studying the theoretical applications of temporal manipulation since before your great-grandparents were born. She leaned forward, her expression becoming more serious. The question is not whether you're from the future. That much is obvious to anyone with the proper training. The question is what you're doing here, and whether your presence will help or harm the people of this time. Hermione seemed to reach a decision. We're trying to help, she said quietly. Someone we care about is going to die tonight, unless we can find a way to prevent it. Ah, Bathilda said, understanding flooding her features. The Potter boy. Harry's heart stopped. How did you— My dear child, you have James Potter's exact bone structure and his mother's eyes. Add to that the fact that you're here on this specific day, in this specific village, with enough temporal displacement magic clinging to you to power a small city. Bathilda shrugged. Elementary deduction. You can't tell anyone, Hermione said urgently. If word gets out that Harry Potter has come back from the future to save his parents? Bathilda smiled sadly. My dear, I'm 157 years old. Do you really think I haven't learned to keep secrets by now? Harry felt something loosen in his chest. You'll help us? I didn't say that, Bathilda replied carefully. I said I wouldn't expose you. Help is more complicated. Temporal magic is dangerous business, child. Every change you make sends ripples through causality that can have consequences far beyond what you intend. We know the risks, Hermione said, but we've studied this carefully. We believe we can save them without causing major timeline disruption. Bathilda studied them both for a long moment. And if you're wrong, if saving James and Lily Potter prevents something else that was meant to happen, if the timeline you create is worse than the one you've left behind, then we'll live with the consequences, Harry said firmly. But I can't live with not trying. The old woman's expression softened. Spoken like a true Gryffindor. Very well. I won't help you directly. Temporal magic should never be manipulated by multiple parties simultaneously. But I can tell you that time is running shorter than you realize. What do you mean? Harry asked. Peter Pettigrew was here an hour ago, Bathilda said quietly. He spent 20 minutes standing exactly where you two were standing earlier, staring at the space where the cottage should be. Then he disapparated in a manner suggesting he was going somewhere he very much didn't want to go. Harry felt the blood drain from his face. He's already made contact with Voldemort? If I were a betting woman, I'd say yes. Bathilda's voice was gentle, but implacable. Which means you have perhaps 2 hours before the attack begins. 2 hours. Harry felt the world tilt around him, the comfortable illusion of time dissolving into desperate urgency. We have to do something, he said, starting to rise from his chair. Sit down, Bathilda said firmly. Running about in a panic will help no one. If you're truly committed to this course of action, you need to think strategically. Harry forced himself to settle back into his chair, though every instinct screamed at him to take action. What can we do? Hermione asked. If the betrayal has already happened, if Voldemort already knows where they are, then you need to change the circumstances of the attack itself, Bathilda replied. You can't prevent Voldemort from coming. He's already committed to that course of action, but you can potentially change what he finds when he arrives. How? Harry asked desperately. Bathilda was quiet for a moment, her pale eyes distant with thought. The Fidelius charm will break the moment Peter Pettigrew dies, or chooses to reveal the secret. But there are other forms of concealment, other ways to protect a dwelling. We researched protection spells, Hermione said quickly. Ancient magic based on love and sacrifice, but without requiring death. Ignotus Peveril's work, Bathilda interrupted with approval. Brilliant wizard, terrible at explaining his theories clearly. But yes, That magic could work. The difficulty is implementation. What do you mean? Harry asked. Peveril's protection spells require the willing participation of all parties involved. Your parents would need to cast the magic themselves, with full knowledge of what they were doing and why. Bathilda's expression grew troubled. Which means you would need to reveal yourselves to them. The circular problem that had been haunting them from the beginning. To save his parents, they would need to trust them with the truth. But revealing the truth could itself be dangerous, both to the timeline and to any chance of success. There might be another way, Bathilda said slowly, but it would require considerable risk on your part. What kind of risk? Hermione asked. You would need to be present during the attack itself, Bathilda explained. Not as observers, but as participants. The magic you're contemplating requires witnesses, individuals who can anchor the protective spells through their own willpower and emotional investment. Harry felt his pulse quicken. We'd be there when Voldemort attacks. You'd be there as part of the magical working that saves your parents' lives, Bathilda corrected. But yes, you would be present during the confrontation with the Dark Lord. The danger was obvious and terrifying. They would be two 13-year-olds facing the most powerful dark wizard in history, armed with theoretical knowledge and desperate determination. Could it work? Harry asked. Possibly, Bathilda said. But the risks extend beyond physical danger. If you're present when Voldemort's killing curse fails, and for your parents to survive, it must fail. You'll be witnesses to magic that could fundamentally alter your understanding of how the world works. Harry thought about the green light from his dreams, about the scar on his forehead that had shaped his entire life. Some risks are worth taking. Bathilda studied his face for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Yes, she said finally. I believe they are. She stood from the table, moving with the careful dignity of great age. If you're truly committed to this course, you should know that the cottage will become visible again once the Fidelius charm breaks. That will be your signal to act. How will we know when that happens? Hermione asked. You'll know, Bathilda said simply. The magical distortion will collapse, and suddenly you'll be able to see what was always there. She started to walk away, then paused and looked back at them. One more thing. The magic you're attempting to use, love-based protection spells, they work best when cast by people who have something to lose. Your parents have their lives and their child to protect. But you two? What exactly are you risking by being there? Harry thought about their timeline, about Ron and the Weasleys and Hogwarts and everything they were potentially giving up forever. Everything. Bathilda's smile was sad but approving. Then you might actually succeed. As the old historian walked away, Harry and Hermione sat in silence, the weight of their decision settling around them. The attack would begin within hours. They would need to be ready. Are we really going to do this? Hermione asked quietly. Harry looked at the empty space where his parents were living their last hours of peace, thinking about the green light and the cottage from his dreams and the chance to finally save the people who had died for him. Yes, he said. We are. The sun was beginning to set over Godric's Hollow, painting the village in shades of gold and amber. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell chimed the hour. Time was running out, but for the first time since arriving in 1981, Harry felt like they had a real plan. Tonight, when Voldemort came for the Potter family, he would find more than he bargained for. The sun died over Godric's Hollow, like a promise being broken. Harry watched from their concealed position in the garden of an abandoned cottage, his entire body tense with anticipation and terror. Beside him, Hermione checked her wand for the 10th time, her face pale but determined in the growing darkness. 8 o'clock, she whispered, consulting the pocket watch they'd borrowed from the room of requirement. If Bathilda was right about the timing, she didn't need to finish. They both felt it, a wrongness creeping across the village like frost, a darkness that had nothing to do with the setting sun. The very air seemed to thicken with malevolent magic, pressing against their skin like oil. Harry's scar began to burn. It started as a dull ache, familiar from his nightmares, but rapidly intensified into something that made him gasp and press his hand to his forehead. The pain was different from anything he'd experienced, not the sharp stabs he was used to, but a deep, resonant agony that seemed to vibrate through his bones. "Harry!" Hermione's voice was tight with concern. "He's coming!" Harry managed through gritted teeth. "He's actually coming!" The magical distortion around the hidden Potter cottage began to waver. What had been an absolute void in their perception started to flicker, like a candle flame in wind. Through the fluctuations, Harry caught glimpses of something that made his heart stop. A small cottage with warm light glowing from its windows, smoke curling from the chimney, a garden gate painted blue. "The Fidelius charm is weakening," Hermione breathed. "Something's happening to Peter." As if summoned by her words, a figure appeared in the street with the distinctive crack of apparition. Peter Pettigrew looked exactly as Harry remembered from their third year, short, balding, with watery eyes and nervous gestures. But there was something desperate about him now, a hunted quality that made Harry's stomach clench with understanding. Peter stood in the street for a moment, staring at the space where the cottage was hidden, his hands shaking violently. Even from their concealed position, Harry could see the man's internal struggle, the war between loyalty and fear playing out across his features. "He doesn't want to do it," Harry realized suddenly. "He's terrified." "That doesn't matter now," Hermione replied, but her voice carried a note of pity. "Harry, we need to move. If he completes the betrayal—" But Peter wasn't alone. As they watched, another figure materialized beside him, tall, pale, with red eyes that seemed to burn in the darkness. Lord Voldemort had come to claim his victory. Harry had seen Voldemort before, in the graveyard during his 4th year. But this was different. This Voldemort was at the height of his power, radiating dark magic like heat from a forge. The very ground seemed to wither beneath his feet, and the air around him shimmered with barely contained malevolence. "Show me," Voldemort commanded, his voice carrying clearly across the night air. Peter raised a trembling hand toward the hidden cottage. "The Potters live there," he whispered, the words torn from him like confession. "James and Lily Potter. And their son." The moment the secret was spoken aloud, the Fidelius charm shattered. The cottage appeared as if someone had pulled away a curtain, suddenly and completely visible. It was smaller than Harry had imagined, but perfect in its domestic comfort. Thatched roof, climbing roses, a child's toy broomstick propped against the front door. Light spilled from the downstairs windows, revealing glimpses of the life within. And there, framed in the front window like a living portrait, Harry saw his father. James Potter was playing with a baby, with baby Harry himself, lifting the child high in the air while the infant giggled with delight. The scene was so achingly normal, so full of love and joy, that Harry felt his breath catch in his throat. "That's me," he whispered, wonder-struck. "That's actually me." "Harry, we need to focus," Hermione said urgently, but her voice was thick with emotion too. Voldemort was advancing toward the cottage, his wand raised, dark magic crackling around him like lightning. Peter scurried behind, clearly wanting to be anywhere else but trapped by fear and circumstance. "Now," Hermione said. "We have to act now." They rose from their hiding place, moving as quietly as they could through the abandoned garden. The plan Bathilda had suggested was risky beyond measure. They would need to get close enough to the cottage to anchor the protective magic, but far enough away to avoid being caught in Voldemort's initial attack. As they crept closer, Harry could hear voices from inside the cottage. James laughing at something, a woman's voice calling from another room. His mother. He was hearing his mother's voice for the first time in his conscious memory. "James, could you put Harry down for a moment and help me with—" The sentence cut off abruptly. Through the window, Harry saw his father's head snap up, his expression shifting from joy to alarm in an instant. James had sensed the dark magic approaching. "Lily!" James shouted, snatching up baby Harry and backing away from the window. "Lily, take Harry and run! It's him! It's Voldemort!" The scene inside the cottage exploded into desperate activity. Harry caught a glimpse of his mother, red hair flying, green eyes wide with terror, as she rushed into the room. She was beautiful and young and alive, and the sight of her made something crack open in Harry's chest. "The back door," Lily was saying, her voice remarkably steady despite the terror in her eyes. "There's no time," James interrupted. "He's right outside." And he was. Voldemort had reached the garden gate, his red eyes fixed on the cottage with predatory satisfaction. Peter cowered behind him, looking as if he desperately wanted to run. "This is it," Harry breathed. "This is the moment everything went wrong." But it didn't have to go wrong. Not this time. Hermione was already moving her wand in the complex patterns Bathilda had described, muttering incantations in ancient Latin that would anchor protective magic to the cottage's foundations. The spells required multiple casters, which was why they both needed to be here. Both needed to risk everything. "Amor vincit omnia," Hermione whispered, her wand tracing golden threads of light that only they could see. "Sanguis et sacrificium, vita et eternitas." Harry joined his magic to hers, feeling the ancient protective spells take shape around them. But the magic felt incomplete, somehow hollow. It needed something more to activate fully. "It's not working," he said desperately. "The protection isn't taking hold." "Because they don't know we're here," Hermione realized. "The magic requires willing participation from the protected family. They have to choose to accept the protection." Voldemort had reached the front door. Harry watched in horror as the Dark Lord raised his wand, preparing to blast through the cottage's mundane defenses. "We have to warn them," Harry said. "We have to tell them what we're doing. But if we don't reveal ourselves, they die anyway." Hermione stared at him for a moment, then nodded grimly. Together, they broke cover, running toward the cottage as Voldemort began his assault on the door. Dark magic crackled through the air, and Harry felt his scar explode with pain as they got closer to the Dark Lord's position. "James Potter!" Harry shouted, his voice cracking with desperation. "Don't fight him alone. Let us help." The effect was immediate and chaotic. Voldemort spun around, his red eyes widening with shock at the sight of two children appearing from nowhere. James Potter's face appeared at the front window, his expression shifting from terror to complete bewilderment. "Who are you?" James called out, his wand trained on Voldemort, but his eyes fixed on Harry and Hermione. "We're here to save you," Hermione shouted back, her wand still weaving protective magic. "Please, you have to trust us. You have to accept our help." Voldemort's confusion was rapidly transforming into rage. "How dare you interfere?" he snarled, turning his wand toward them. "Who sent you? What are you?" Harry felt a moment of pure terror as those red eyes fixed on him, but he forced himself to stand firm. "We're your worst nightmare," he said, surprised by the steadiness of his own voice. "We're the future you'll never see." The Dark Lord's face contorted with fury, but before he could cast a curse, James Potter made his decision. "I accept," James called out, his voice carrying clearly across the night air. "Whatever you're offering, whatever protection you can give us, I accept it for my family." The moment the words were spoken, the protective magic blazed to life. Golden light erupted around the cottage, spreading outward in waves that made the very air sing with power. Harry felt the ancient magic take hold, weaving itself through the foundations of the building and the hearts of the people within. Love-based protection, powered by willing sacrifice and anchored by future knowledge, blazing brighter than any Fidelius charm. Voldemort's curse struck the protective barrier and shattered like glass against stone. "Impossible!" the Dark Lord shrieked, his composure finally cracking. "No protection can stand against the killing curse." "This one can," Harry said, feeling power flow through him that had nothing to do with his own magic and everything to do with love freely given and freely received. Because it's not just protecting them from you, it's protecting them for us. Voldemort turned his full attention to the two children who had appeared from nowhere to defy him. His wand rose, green light gathering at its tip, and Harry realized with crystal clarity that they were about to die. But James Potter had other plans. The front door burst open, and James charged out, his own wand blazing with protective magic. But instead of attacking Voldemort directly, he positioned himself between the Dark Lord and the two children who had come to save his family. "If you want to hurt them," James said, his voice steady despite the terror Harry could see in his eyes, "you'll have to go through me first." It was the same fierce protectiveness Harry remembered from his father's voice in the graveyard, the same willingness to sacrifice himself for others. But this time it might not be a sacrifice at all. "How touching," Voldemort sneered. "The blood traitor dies defending strange children. Avada Kedavra." The green light erupted from his wand, racing toward James with lethal intent. But the curse struck the protective barrier that surrounded all of them now, not just the cottage, and something extraordinary happened. The killing curse rebounded. Not cleanly, not completely, but enough to send Voldemort staggering backward, his red eyes wide with shock and the first hint of fear. The protective magic held, strengthened by James's willingness to die for strangers, and powered by love that transcended time itself. "This is impossible," Voldemort whispered, staring at his own wand as if it had betrayed him. "No," Harry said, stepping forward despite the danger, despite the pain in his scar that was now almost unbearable. "This is love. This is what you never understood." He looked past Voldemort to where Peter Pettigrew cowered in the shadows, the man who had betrayed his parents' location, but who looked more terrified than triumphant. "Peter," Harry called out, his voice carrying across the garden, "it's not too late. You can still choose differently." Pettigrew looked up with watery eyes full of confusion and desperate hope. I don't." "You can choose to protect them instead of betraying them," Harry continued. "You can be the friend they thought you were." For a moment, Peter stood frozen between his fear of Voldemort and the possibility of redemption. Then, slowly, he raised his wand, not toward the Potters, but toward his master. "Stupefy!" Peter shouted, his voice cracking with emotion. The stunning spell struck Voldemort in the back, adding its power to the already chaotic magical forces swirling around the cottage. The Dark Lord stumbled, his concentration broken, and the protective magic pressed closer around him like golden chains. "You dare!" Voldemort turned on his former servant, red eyes blazing with murderous rage. But Peter was already running, disapparating with a crack that echoed through the night air, leaving his former master alone to face the consequences of his actions. Voldemort found himself surrounded, by protective magic he couldn't break, by a man willing to die for strangers, by two children who somehow knew exactly what he was and what he represented. The cottage blazed with golden light behind them, and from within came the sound of a woman's voice, singing softly to soothe a frightened child. "This isn't over," Voldemort snarled, backing toward the garden gate. "Yes, it is," Hermione said quietly, her wand still weaving threads of protective magic. "You've lost, Tom. You just don't know it yet." The use of his birth name made Voldemort's face contort with rage, but the protective magic was too strong now, fed by too many sources of love and sacrifice. He could not approach the cottage, could not harm the family within, could not even maintain his position in the face of magic that was fundamentally opposed to everything he represented. "I will return," he promised, his voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "I will find another way. I will destroy them all." "Maybe," Harry said, feeling exhaustion begin to creep in as the protective magic drew on his own strength. "But not tonight. Tonight, they live." Voldemort disapparated with a sound like thunder, leaving behind only the smell of smoke and the echo of thwarted malice. The sudden silence that followed was almost overwhelming after the intensity of magical combat. James Potter stood in his garden, staring at the two children who had appeared from nowhere to save his family. His face was pale with shock but alive with desperate hope. "Who are you?" he asked again, his voice gentler now but still wary. Harry looked at his father, young and alive and breathing, with messy black hair and glasses that were identical to his own, and felt words stick in his throat. How do you tell someone you're their son from the future? How do you explain that you've traveled through time to prevent their death? "We're friends," Hermione said finally. "We're people who care about you and your family very much." "How did you know to come here? How did you know what was going to happen?" "Because we've lived through it before," Harry said quietly. "In a different time, in a different way. We came back to make sure it ended differently." James stared at him for a long moment, his green eyes, so like Harry's own, taking in details that Harry realized might be uncomfortably familiar. "You look," James began, then shook his head. "No, that's impossible." Before Harry could respond, the front door opened, and Lily Potter emerged, carrying baby Harry in her arms. She looked from her husband to the two strange children in their garden, her expression shifting from fear to confusion to something like wonder. "James," she said quietly. "Who are they?" Harry felt his breath catch as he looked at his mother. Really looked at her. Not just glimpsed her through a window or seen her face in photographs. She was young and beautiful and radiantly alive, with red hair that caught the light from the cottage and green eyes that were exactly like his own. "Mum," he whispered, the word escaping before he could stop it. Lily's eyes widened, her grip tightening protectively on the baby in her arms. "What did you say?" "Nothing," Harry said quickly, but it was too late. The word hung in the air between them like a confession. James was staring at him with growing recognition, his face pale with shock. The hair, the eyes, the bone structure. He looked at the baby in Lily's arms, then back at Harry. "It's not possible." "James," Lily said, her voice barely above a whisper. "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking," James said slowly, "that these children have traveled a very long way to be here tonight." Harry and Hermione exchanged glances. The protective magic was still holding, but it required constant concentration to maintain, and they were both beginning to feel the strain. They couldn't keep this up much longer. "We should go," Hermione said quietly. "We've done what we came to do. Your family is safe now." "Safe from what, exactly?" Lily asked, though Harry suspected she already knew the answer. "From the man who would have killed you tonight," Harry said simply. "From the future where your son grew up without parents, where he had to fight monsters and madmen and face darkness. He was too young to understand." Lily's free hand went to her throat. "But he didn't kill us. We're alive." "You're alive," Harry agreed, feeling tears prick at his eyes. "You're alive and safe and together, and your son gets to grow up with parents who love him." "Our son," James said quietly, his eyes still fixed on Harry's face, "gets to grow up with parents who love him. But what about you? What happens to the son who grew up without us?" The question hit Harry like a physical blow. What did happen to him now? In changing the timeline, had he erased himself? Would he return to a world where he'd never existed, where another version of himself, one raised by loving parents, had taken his place? "I don't know," he admitted, "but it doesn't matter. What matters is that you're alive, that you get to watch him grow up, that he never has to know what it's like to be alone." Lily was crying now, tears streaming down her face as she looked at the boy who was somehow both her son and not her son, the child who had traveled through time to save parents he'd never really known. "How can we repay you?" she asked. "How can we thank you for what you've done?" "Live," Harry said simply. "Love him." give him the childhood I never had. The protective magic was beginning to fade as their strength waned. Harry could feel the ancient spells settling into the cottage's foundations, becoming part of its permanent defenses. But the golden light that had surrounded them all was dimming. "We have to go," Hermione said urgently. "Harry, we can't maintain this much longer." Harry nodded, understanding. But as they turned to leave, James called out to them. "Wait," he said. "At least tell us your names. Let us know who we're in debt to." Harry hesitated, then made a decision that would either damn them all or set them free. "I'm Harry," he said quietly. "And this is Hermione. We're your son's best friends." "His best friends?" Lily repeated, wonder and pain warring in her voice. "From the future he won't have to live now." "From the future we chose to give up so he could have a better one," Hermione corrected gently. James and Lily Potter stood in their garden, holding their infant son, looking at the two children who had sacrificed everything to save them. The cottage glowed with warm light behind them, and in the distance, the village of Godric's Hollow settled into peaceful sleep. "Thank you," James said, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for bringing us home." Harry nodded, not trusting himself to speak. As he and Hermione turned to leave, he heard his mother's voice calling after them. "Harry!" He turned back one last time to see Lily Potter standing at her garden gate, her infant son in her arms, her face radiant with love and gratitude. "Tell him," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the night air. "Wherever you go, whatever happens, tell our Harry that we love him, that we've always loved him." "He knows," Harry replied, his voice cracking with emotion. "He's always known." As they walked away from the cottage, leaving the Potter family safe and alive and together, Harry felt something fundamental shift in the world around them. The timeline was changing, rewriting itself around their intervention, and he had no idea what they would find when the changes settled. But for the first time in his life, he had seen his parents alive and happy and safe. For the first time in his life, he had heard his mother say she loved him. Whatever the cost, whatever the consequences, it had been worth it. The night was quiet around them as they made their way back through the village, leaving behind a future that would never exist and stepping into one they could only hope would be better. Behind them, in a cottage that glowed with protective magic, James and Lily Potter held their son close and whispered promises about the life they would build together, the childhood they would give him, the love that would surround him every day. The night everything had gone wrong had become the night everything was finally made right, and somewhere in the space between one timeline and another, Harry Potter finally went to sleep without nightmares. The silence that followed Voldemort's retreat was deafening. Harry stood in the garden of the cottage, his legs trembling with exhaustion and the aftershock of magical combat, staring at the space where the Dark Lord had been moments before. The protective magic still hummed through the air around them, but it felt different now. Not the blazing intensity of active defense, but the steady, settled warmth of permanent protection. "He's really gone," Hermione breathed beside him, her own voice shaky with disbelief. "For now," Harry replied, though even as he said it, he felt something fundamental had changed. The magical signature of Voldemort's retreat hadn't been the tactical withdrawal of someone planning an immediate return. It had been the desperate flight of someone whose entire worldview had just been shattered. James Potter still stood near the cottage door, his wand raised and his body positioned protectively between his family and any potential threat. But his eyes were fixed on Harry with an intensity that made Harry's chest tight with recognition and wonder. "James," Lily called softly from the doorway, her infant son quiet in her arms. "I think they need help." It was true. Harry could feel the magical exhaustion pulling at him like a tide, the consequence of channeling protective spells far beyond his normal capacity. Beside him, Hermione swayed on her feet, her face pale with strain. "Come inside," James said, lowering his wand but not quite relaxing his vigilant stance. "Both of you, you've done something impossible tonight, and you look ready to collapse." The cottage interior was everything Harry had imagined, and nothing he was prepared for. It was smaller than the burrow, but filled with the same sense of warmth and belonging. Photographs covered the mantelpiece. James and Lily's wedding, baby pictures of himself, images of friends who were young and laughing and alive. The furniture was comfortable rather than elegant, clearly chosen for a life being lived rather than displayed. "Sit," Lily instructed, settling them both on the sofa with the practiced efficiency of someone accustomed to caring for people. "James, put the kettle on, and check the wards, all of them." Harry sank into the cushions and felt something inside him that had been tightly wound for weeks finally begin to relax. They had done it. Against all odds, despite every danger and complication, they had actually done it. His parents were alive. "Drink this," Lily said, pressing a cup of tea into his hands. The liquid was warm and sweet, and somehow tasted of safety. "Thank you," Harry managed, though the words felt inadequate for everything he wanted to express. Lily settled into the chair across from him, her infant son, his infant self, sleeping peacefully in her arms. Harry found himself staring at the baby, trying to reconcile the quiet child with his own memories of loneliness and struggle. "He looks so peaceful," Hermione observed softly. "He should," Lily replied, her voice carrying a note of fierce protectiveness. "No child should have to grow up in fear." James returned from checking the cottage's defences, his expression troubled. "The protective magic you two anchored is holding beautifully," he reported. "But there are signs that other people are taking notice. I've detected at least 3 different groups of wizards approaching the village. Order members," Hermione said immediately. They would have felt the magical disturbance from the battle. "Order of the Phoenix?" Lily asked sharply. "We know about them," Harry said quietly. "We know about a lot of things we probably shouldn't." James settled into the chair beside his wife, his green eyes, so like Harry's own, studying both children with growing comprehension. "You're not from this time," he said. It wasn't a question. "No," Harry replied, seeing no point in continued deception. "We're not." "How far?" Lily asked, her historian's curiosity overcoming her caution. "Far enough to know what was supposed to happen tonight," Hermione answered carefully. "Far enough to know it was wrong." Before James could respond, sharp cracks of apparition echoed from the garden. Multiple arrivals, coming fast and urgent. James was on his feet instantly, wand drawn. "Stay here," he instructed, moving toward the window. "James Potter," a familiar voice called from outside. "Are you alive in there?" "Sirius," Lily breathed, relief evident in her voice. James opened the door to reveal 3 figures standing in the garden, Sirius Black, Remus Lupin, and a tall witch Harry didn't recognize. All 3 looked as if they'd come prepared for battle, their wands out, and their expressions grim. "We felt the magical discharge from 20 miles away," Sirius said without preamble, his dark eyes scanning the cottage and its occupants for signs of harm. "What happened? Where's Peter? Is everyone—" His words died as his gaze fell on Harry and Hermione, 2 children who obviously didn't belong in this time or place. "Who are they?" Remus asked quietly, his scarred face tense with suspicion. "Our saviors," James replied simply. "They're the reason we're still alive." "James," the unknown witch said sharply. "You can't just—" "Marlene," Lily interrupted. "They saved us. From Voldemort himself. Whatever else they are, they're not our enemies." Harry felt something twist in his chest at the sight of these young faces he knew would age into mentors and father figures and tragic victims. Sirius looked barely older than Bill Weasley, his face unmarked by Azkaban's horrors. Remus was thin but healthy, his brown hair untouched by premature grey. "Voldemort was here?" Sirius demanded, his attention snapping back to James. "How did he find you? The Fidelius charm should have—" "Peter," James said simply, and the name fell between them like a stone. Sirius went very still. Peter betrayed you? Peter betrayed us, Lily confirmed, her voice steady, despite the pain in her eyes. But he redeemed himself at the end. He turned against Voldemort when it mattered. Where is he now? Remus asked, his quiet voice carrying an edge Harry had never heard before. Gone, Hermione said. He disapparated when Voldemort turned on him. Marlene, Harry assumed she was Marlene McKinnon from the stories he'd heard, stepped forward, her wand still raised. I don't care how young they look, she said firmly. No one should have been able to penetrate the protections on this cottage. No one should have known where it was. They knew because they're from the future, James said calmly, as if he were discussing the weather. The silence that followed was profound. James, Sirius said carefully, I think you may have hit your head during the battle. No head injuries, Lily said dryly, though I understand your skepticism. She looked at Harry and Hermione, her expression thoughtful. Would you be willing to provide some proof? I know it's a lot to ask, but if we're going to trust you with our lives— Harry understood completely. They were asking him to reveal information that would confirm his identity beyond doubt, to prove his claims in a way that couldn't be faked or coincidental. October 31st, 1979, he said quietly. James and Lily Potter were married in a ceremony at St. Margaret's Chapel. The wedding was attended by 43 people, including Sirius Black as best man and Alice Longbottom as maid of honor. Lily wore her mother's wedding dress, altered with magic because it was 2 sizes too large. James forgot the rings and had to axio them from the cottage, where he'd left them on the kitchen table. Sirius's face went white. How could you possibly know that? Because you told me, Harry said simply. Years from now, when I was old enough to ask about them, you told me everything you could remember about the people you loved. You, Remus said slowly, staring at Harry's face with growing recognition. You're their son. From the future. I'm their son who grew up without them, Harry corrected. I'm the Harry Potter who lived through everything you were trying to prevent by hiding them here. Marlene lowered her wand, her expression shifting from suspicion to something approaching awe. Time travel. You came back to save them. We came back to save all of you, Hermione said quietly. To stop the war from taking the people it took, to prevent the tragedies that shaped our childhood. And you succeeded, James said, his voice carrying wonder and gratitude in equal measure. Voldemort came here tonight expecting to find us helpless and alone. Instead, he found a family protected by magic he couldn't understand and defended by people who knew exactly what he was. He won't give up, Sirius warned. Voldemort doesn't accept defeat. He'll regroup, find another way. No, Harry interrupted, surprising everyone, including himself, with his certainty. He won't. Not the same way, anyway. How can you be sure? Marlene asked. Harry thought about the look in Voldemort's red eyes as the killing curse rebounded, the shock and fear that had replaced his usual cold confidence. Because tonight wasn't just a tactical defeat. It was a fundamental challenge to everything he believes about magic and power and death. The protection magic we used, Hermione added, it's based on love and willing sacrifice. Not death, but the choice to risk death for others. It's everything Voldemort despises and nothing he can understand or replicate. Which means he'll be more dangerous than ever, Remus pointed out grimly. A cornered animal with nothing left to lose. But not invincible, Lily said firmly. If the protection magic worked once. It worked because the circumstances were exactly right, Hermione explained. Multiple people willing to sacrifice themselves for others, ancient magic properly anchored, and enough emotional investment to power the protective spells. It's not something that can be easily replicated. Then we make sure the circumstances stay right, James said, with the kind of quiet determination Harry remembered from his few glimpses of his father's character. We work together, we protect each other, and we don't let fear make us careless. Baby Harry stirred in Lily's arms, making the small sounds infants make when they're beginning to wake. Harry watched his mother soothe the child with practiced expertise, humming softly under her breath, and felt something ache in his chest. "What happens now?" he asked quietly. "Now." James looked around the cottage, walls scorched from magical combat, protective wards glowing faintly in the air, friends gathered around his family in the aftermath of victory. Now we live. We raise our son in peace. We help our friends survive this war, and we try to build the world you came back to create. "But what about us?" Hermione asked. "We don't belong here. We're paradoxes now, people who exist outside the natural flow of time." It was the question Harry had been avoiding, the practical reality of their success. They had saved his parents, but in doing so, had they erased themselves? Did they still have a place in this timeline, or were they ghosts of a future that would never exist? "You belong wherever you choose to belong," Lily said firmly. "You've earned the right to make that decision for yourselves." "The magical community won't see it that way," Marlene pointed out. "Time travel on this scale, changing events this significant. The Ministry will want to investigate, to study you, possibly to confine you." "Then the Ministry won't know about them," Sirius said, with the kind of casual defiance that Harry remembered from his godfather's stories. "As far as anyone outside this room is concerned, Voldemort's attack was repelled by the cottage's existing defenses and James's dueling skills." "And Peter's betrayal?" Remus asked. "Never happened," James said without hesitation. "Peter Pettigrew disappeared during a mission for the Order. Presumed dead, possibly captured. The Fidelius charm failed because something happened to the secret keeper." Harry felt a wash of gratitude for these people who were willing to protect him and Hermione despite barely knowing them, who were prepared to lie to their own government to keep two time-traveling children safe. "There will still be questions," Hermione pointed out, "about how you survived, about the nature of the protective magic, about what happened to Voldemort." "Let there be questions," Lily said, with a smile that reminded Harry powerfully of his own stubborn streak. "Some mysteries are worth preserving." A soft knock at the door interrupted their planning. James tensed, his wand rising automatically, but Sirius moved to the window first. "Dumbledore," he announced. "Of course," Lily sighed. "I should have expected he'd come as soon as he felt the magical discharge." "What do we tell him?" Harry asked, suddenly nervous. Dumbledore in this timeline would be younger, but no less perceptive. If anyone could see through their careful deceptions, it would be the future headmaster. "Nothing," James said firmly. "We tell him nothing he doesn't need to know to keep us all safe." The door opened to reveal Albus Dumbledore, but not the Dumbledore Harry remembered. This version was younger, his auburn hair only beginning to silver, his face less lined by sorrow and responsibility. But his blue eyes held the same piercing intelligence, and they fixed on Harry with immediate recognition. "Good evening," Dumbledore said mildly, stepping into the cottage with the easy familiarity of a welcome guest. "I trust everyone is well." "We're alive," James replied carefully, "thanks to some unexpected help." Dumbledore's gaze moved to Harry and Hermione, and Harry felt the uncomfortable sensation of being examined by one of the most powerful wizards of the age. Indeed, and what manner of help might that have been? The kind that asks no questions and expects no explanations, Lily said smoothly. Dumbledore's eyebrows rose slightly, but he made no immediate comment. Instead, he moved through the cottage, his experienced eyes taking in the scorch marks on the walls, the lingering traces of powerful magic, the protective wards, still humming with energy. "Fascinating," he murmured, pausing near the fireplace where the magical residue was strongest. "Love-based protection magic, anchored with considerable skill and powered by—" He paused, his head tilting thoughtfully. "By emotional investment that spans a considerable temporal distance." Harry felt his blood freeze. Dumbledore had identified their time travel magic with a single glance at the cottage's magical residue. "Albus," James said, warningly. "Peace, James. I have no intention of prying into secrets that are clearly meant to remain hidden." Dumbledore turned back to them, his expression kind, but troubled. "I will say only this. Magic leaves traces, and some traces are more significant than others. Whatever assistance you received tonight was both powerful and unprecedented." "Does it matter where help comes from?" Sirius asked, "as long as it saves lives?" "An excellent question," Dumbledore replied, "and one I suspect will become increasingly relevant in the days to come." He moved toward the door, then paused and looked back at Harry. "Young man, you have your father's face and your mother's eyes, but you also have something else, a quality I associate with those who have seen too much darkness and chosen light anyway. I hope you find peace in whatever path you choose to follow." Harry nodded, not trusting himself to speak. After Dumbledore left, the cottage fell into contemplative silence. The immediate danger had passed, but the implications of their success were only beginning to sink in. "He knows," Hermione said quietly. "Dumbledore knows many things," Remus replied. "It doesn't mean he'll act on them." "The question," Marlene said practically, "is what happens next. Voldemort may have retreated tonight, but he's still out there. Still dangerous. We prepare," James said simply. "We strengthen our defenses, we protect our friends, and we make sure tonight's victory isn't wasted." "And in the meantime?" Harry asked. Lily looked at him with eyes full of maternal warmth and impossible sadness. "In the meantime, you have a choice to make. You can try to return to your own time, or you can stay here and help us build the future you came back to create." "What happens to the future we left behind?" Hermione asked. "The people we knew there?" "I don't know," Lily admitted. "Time's magic is beyond my expertise. But I suspect that changing something this significant creates multiple timeline branches, rather than erasing what came before." "So the Harry Potter who grew up without parents still exists?" Harry asked. "Somewhere. Along with the Hermione Granger, who was his best friend, and the Ron Weasley who stood by them both," Lily confirmed. "They exist in the timeline where I died to save my son. That timeline has its own validity, its own importance. But this timeline," James added, "the one where we all live, where we have the chance to end this war properly, this timeline needs you too. Both of you." Harry looked around the cottage, taking in the faces of people he'd known as memories and stories, people who were young and alive and full of hope. This was what he'd always dreamed of, a family, friends, a place where he truly belonged. "There's something else to consider," Remus said quietly. "Your knowledge of future events, of what Voldemort will try next, of which tactics succeeded and which failed. That information could save lives." "We can help you end this war properly," Hermione realized. "Not just survive it, but win it in a way that prevents future conflicts." "And in return?" Harry asked. "In return," Lily said, shifting the sleeping baby in her arms, "you get to have the childhood that was stolen from you. You get to grow up with people who love you, in a world where you're not the boy who lived, but simply Harry Potter, beloved son and trusted friend." Harry felt tears prick at his eyes. It was everything he'd ever wanted, offered freely and without conditions. "What about Ron?" he asked suddenly. "In this timeline, will we still meet him? Will the three of us still become friends?" "The Weasleys are good people," Sirius said with a grin. "I suspect you'll find your way to each other eventually." "And if you don't," Hermione added practically, "we'll make sure you do. Some friendships are too important to leave to chance." As the evening wore on, the cottage filled with quiet planning and careful hope. They discussed security measures and communication protocols, safe houses and emergency procedures. But underneath the practical concerns, Harry sensed something deeper, the beginning of the kind of family he'd always dreamed of having, When the others finally left, promising to return the next day with additional protections and resources, Harry found himself alone with his parents for the first time in his conscious memory. "You don't have to decide tonight," James said gently, settling into his chair with a cup of tea. "About staying, about what comes next. There's time to think it through." "For the first time in your life," Lily added, "there's actually time." Harry looked at them, his young parents, alive and safe and willing to build a future with him, and felt something settle into peace in his chest. "I'd like to stay," he said quietly, "if you'll have me." Lily's smile could have powered protective wards for a century. "Harry Potter," she said, "you'll always have a place here. In every timeline, in every possible future, you will always be our son." And for the first time since the dreams had started, Harry believed it might actually be true. Outside, the village of Godric's Hollow settled into peaceful sleep, protected by magic born of love and sacrifice, and the unshakable belief that some things are worth changing the entire world to preserve. The war would continue, but it would be different now. They would face it together, armed with knowledge from the future, and strengthened by bonds that transcended time itself. Harry Potter finally had a family, and this time nothing would take them away from him. The prophecy had always been wrong. Harry realized this 3 days after Voldemort's failed attack, sitting in the kitchen of a safe house in Wales while Hermione pored over ancient texts, and his parents argued quietly about defensive strategies in the next room. The revelation came to him not as a sudden epiphany, but as a slow, creeping certainty that changed everything he thought he understood about his own life. "Neither can live while the other survives," he murmured, reading the words Professor Trelawney had spoken in his 3rd year. But what if that was never about death? What if it was about choice? Hermione looked up from her research into Horcrux detection spells, her expression shifting from distraction to sharp interest. "What do you mean?" Harry gestured to the prophecy transcription Dumbledore had provided, the words that had shaped his original timeline and driven Voldemort to murder his parents. "Look at the actual language. Neither can live while the other survives. Not neither can live while the other lives, but while the other survives. The distinction being, living and surviving aren't the same thing," Harry said, the pieces clicking together with frightening clarity. "You can survive without truly living. You can exist, endure, persist, but still be trapped by circumstances that prevent you from having a real life." Hermione set down her quill, giving him her full attention. So the prophecy was saying that as long as Voldemort continued to exist in his half-life state, sustained by Horcruxes, neither fully alive nor truly dead, I could never have a normal existence. And as long as I was marked by his curse, defined by his attempts to kill me, he could never move beyond his obsession with destroying me. The implications were staggering. But if Voldemort were to die completely, without Horcruxes to anchor him, then I could live, Harry finished. Actually live, not just survive. And if I could escape the cycle of conflict he created, then he wouldn't be surviving either. He'd be gone, finished, ended. They stared at each other across the kitchen table, the weight of this reinterpretation settling between them like a key turning in a lock. "That means the prophecy isn't invalidated by what we did," Hermione breathed. "It's fulfilled differently. Your parents surviving doesn't change the fundamental requirement. Voldemort still needs to be completely destroyed for you to have a real life. And for him to be completely destroyed, we need to find and eliminate every Horcrux he's created," Hermione completed the thought. "All of them. Not just the ones from our timeline, but any he might have made differently in this one." The kitchen door opened and James entered, carrying a cup of tea and looking older than his 21 years. The past 3 days had aged all of them. The constant vigilance, the knowledge that their victory was temporary, the crushing responsibility of using future knowledge to prevent further tragedy. "You two look like you've solved the riddle of the universe," James observed, settling into a chair beside Harry. "Just the riddle of the prophecy," Harry replied, then explained their realization about survival versus living, about the true meaning of the words that had defined his existence. James listened with the intense focus Harry remembered from his glimpses of his father's character, asking pointed questions and following logical threads to their conclusions. When Harry finished, James was quiet for a long moment. "So we're not fighting to hide from Voldemort," he said finally. "We're fighting to end him completely." "Which brings us to the information problem," Hermione said, pulling out her notes from their research sessions. "We know about several Horcruxes from our timeline. Tom Riddle's diary, Marvolo Gaunt's ring, Salazar Slytherin's locket, Helga Hufflepuff's cup, Rowena Ravenclaw's diadem, and Nagini his snake, plus the accidental one in Harry's scar." "But that's knowledge from a different timeline," James pointed out. "What if he's made different choices here, created different Horcruxes, hidden them in different places?" "Or made more of them," Harry added grimly. "In our timeline, he planned to create 7 Horcruxes, 6 intentional ones plus the accidental fragment in me. But if he's paranoid about the timeline changes, if he suspects external interference, he might create additional anchors," Hermione finished. "More Horcruxes, hidden in places we'd never think to look." The kitchen fell silent as they contemplated the enormity of the task ahead of them. Hunting Horcruxes in their own timeline had nearly killed them multiple times, and they'd had specific knowledge of what to look for and where to find it. Here, they might be searching blind. "We need Peter," James said suddenly. Harry felt his stomach clench. "What?" "Peter Pettigrew. He was Voldemort's spy, his inside source on Order activities. If anyone knows about Voldemort's secret projects, his hiding places, his long-term plans, it would be Peter." "Assuming he's still alive," Hermione said quietly. "He disapparated during the battle, but that doesn't mean he made it to safety." "He's alive," Harry said with certainty that surprised him. "I can feel it somehow. And more than that, I think he wants to be found." It was true. Over the past 3 days, Harry had experienced odd moments of awareness, brief flashes of guilt and terror and desperate hope that felt distinctly familiar, like emotional echoes of his encounter with Pettigrew during the battle. The magical connection, Hermione realized, when Peter turned against Voldemort, when he chose redemption over loyalty, it created a temporary magical bond between him and the protective magic around the cottage. You were anchoring that magic, so now I have a weak empathic connection to Peter Pettigrew, Harry said, feeling queasy at the thought. Wonderful. Useful, though, James pointed out pragmatically. If you can sense his emotional state, you might be able to track his location. Do we want to find him? Hermione asked. He betrayed you once already. What's to stop him from doing it again? Harry thought about the moment in the garden when Peter had turned his wand on Voldemort, the desperate courage in his watery eyes as he chose to fight rather than flee. Because he knows what the alternative looks like now. He's seen what Voldemort becomes when he's opposed, how quickly mercy turns to murder. And because, James added with grim understanding, he knows that if Voldemort wins, Peter will be the first to die. Traitors aren't rewarded twice. A soft knock at the kitchen door interrupted their planning. Lily poked her head in, her expression troubled. "Dumbledore's here," she announced, "and he's brought someone with him." They made their way to the sitting room to find Dumbledore seated in the armchair by the fire, looking every inch the distinguished professor, despite the early hour. But it was his companion who commanded attention, a thin, nervous-looking wizard with thinning brown hair and robes that had seen better days. "Severus Snape," Dumbledore said by way of introduction. "Meet Harry Potter and Hermione Granger, the remarkable young people who saved James and Lily's lives." Snape's black eyes fixed on Harry with an intensity that made him deeply uncomfortable, This wasn't the bitter, resentful professor Harry remembered from his school years. This Snape was younger, less controlled, his emotions closer to the surface. "You," Snape said quietly, his voice carrying a note of wonder that was completely at odds with the man Harry thought he knew. "You're the one who saved her." "We both did," Harry replied carefully. "Hermione and I worked together." "But you were the one who stepped between Voldemort and James Potter," Snape continued, his gaze never leaving Harry's face. "You chose to protect the man who—" He paused, swallowing hard. "Who had every right to let you die for the way I treated him." Harry felt a chill of understanding. In this timeline, Snape's guilt over Lily's near death was immediate and raw, not tempered by years of self-hatred and gradual redemption. He was seeing the moment of choice that had defined the Snape Harry knew, but witnessing it unfold in real time. "Severus has been providing information about Voldemort's activities," Dumbledore explained. "He was present during several meetings in the weeks leading up to the attack. His intelligence may prove invaluable in understanding what we're truly facing." "How much does he know?" Hermione asked carefully. "About your true origins." Dumbledore's blue eyes twinkled with what might have been amusement. "I have shared only what seemed necessary for the current discussion, though I suspect Severus has drawn his own conclusions." Snape's expression was unreadable. "I know that magic was used during the attack that I have never encountered before. I know that 2 children appeared from nowhere with knowledge they shouldn't possess. And I know that the protective magic around the cottage is based on principles that predate most modern magical theory." "What else?" James asked, his voice carrying the weight of command despite his youth. "Voldemort is changed," Snape said slowly. "Since the attack failed, he has been different. More paranoid, more vicious toward his own followers. He believes the timeline has been manipulated by enemies he cannot identify." Harry and Hermione exchanged glances. "How much does he suspect?" Harry asked. "More than we would like," Dumbledore replied gravely. "Severus reports that Voldemort has begun speaking of temporal warfare and chronological sabotage. He believes someone has interfered with the natural flow of events." "Which means he'll be prepared for our future knowledge," Hermione said grimly. "If he suspects time travel, he'll change his patterns, alter his plans, maybe even relocate his Horcruxes." "Horcruxes?" Snape's voice was sharp with interest. Harry hesitated, then decided that if they were going to trust Snape with their lives, they needed to trust him with the truth. "Objects containing fragments of Voldemort's soul. They prevent him from dying completely, anchor him to life even when his body is destroyed." Snape went very pale. That's impossibly dark magic. The soul-splitting required would drive most wizards insane." "Most wizards aren't Tom Riddle," Dumbledore said quietly. "How many, Severus? How many such objects do you believe he has created?" I don't know for certain, but there have been references to safeguards and insurance against mortality. And recently, since the attack failed, he has been obsessed with creating additional protections." "Additional Horcruxes," Harry said with growing alarm. "He's making more." "Which means our window for hunting the existing ones is closing," Hermione added. "Every day we wait, he becomes harder to kill permanently." Lily had been quiet throughout the conversation, but now she spoke up with the kind of quiet determination Harry recognized from his own moments of resolve. "Then we don't wait. We move now, while we still have advantages he doesn't expect." "What advantages?" Snape asked. "Knowledge," James replied. "We know what he was, what he became, how he thought and planned and hid his secrets. That knowledge may not be perfect anymore, but it's still more than anyone else has." "And we have something he's never faced before," Harry added, looking around the room at the faces of people who had been willing to risk everything for strangers. "We have each other, all of us, working together instead of hiding from each other. A true alliance, Dumbledore mused, not the careful dance of secrets and half-truths that has characterized our resistance thus far, but genuine cooperation based on complete honesty. Complete honesty, Severus repeated, his black eyes fixed on Harry again. Then perhaps you can answer a question that has been troubling me since I first saw you. Why do you look exactly like James Potter would look if he were 13 years old? The silence that followed was deafening. Harry felt every eye in the room focus on him, waiting for the answer he'd been avoiding since their first night in this timeline. Because, Harry said quietly, I am James Potter. Or rather, I'm the son James Potter would have if he lived to raise him properly. You're Harry, Lily breathed, understanding flooding her features. Not just a child with the same name, but actually our Harry. From the future. From a future where you died, Harry confirmed, his voice catching slightly. Where Voldemort killed you and I grew up never knowing what it felt like to have a family. Snape stared at him, with an expression of dawning comprehension and something that might have been horror. The boy who lived, he whispered. The child who survived the killing curse. That's what you would have become. That's what I was, Harry corrected. Famous for something I didn't remember, defined by a tragedy I couldn't prevent, carrying a scar that marked me as different from everyone else I ever met. But not anymore, James said firmly, reaching out to squeeze Harry's shoulder. Now you're just Harry, our son, who happens to have travelled back in time to save his family. The paradox, Dumbledore said softly, his blue eyes distant with thought. A child saving parents who will now raise a different version of himself. Fascinating. And troubling. Troubling how? Hermione asked sharply. The magical implications are unprecedented. Two versions of the same soul existing in the same timeline, one infant and one adolescent. The resonance effects alone could be extraordinary. Harry felt a chill of fear. Are you saying it's dangerous? That something could happen to the baby because I'm here? I'm saying it's uncharted territory, Dumbledore replied carefully. But if I had to speculate, I would suggest that the presence of your older self might actually serve as a form of protection for the child. A magical immune system, if you will. Like an early warning system, Hermione said, understanding immediately. If anything threatened baby Harry, older Harry would sense it first. Precisely. Though the reverse might also be true, threats to the older Harry could affect the infant as well. One more reason to end Voldemort quickly, James said grimly, before he realizes the connection exists and tries to exploit it. About that, Snape interjected, pulling out a roll of parchment from his robes. I have information. Meeting locations, safe house addresses, the identities of Death Eaters who haven't been publicly revealed, and... He hesitated, his face pale with the enormity of what he was about to reveal. And? Lily prompted gently. Locations where Voldemort has been conducting private research. Places he goes alone, where even his most trusted followers are not permitted. If he has been creating these Horcruxes, some of them might be hidden in these locations. Harry felt his pulse quicken. How many locations? 3 that I know of for certain. An abandoned manor house in Little Hangleton, a cave by the sea that requires a blood sacrifice to enter, and a room in Hogwarts that he discovered during his time as a student. The Gaunt Shack, Hermione breathed, the cave where he hid the locket, and the Room of Requirement. You know these places? Snape asked sharply. We know what he did with them, Harry replied. In our timeline, he used those locations to hide some of his most important Horcruxes. Then we have our targets, James said with satisfaction. 3 locations, probably 3 Horcruxes. If we move quickly, before he realizes we know about them. We could destroy half of his anchors to life before he even knows we're hunting them, Lily finished. It won't be that simple, Dumbledore warned. Each location will be heavily protected, and the Horcruxes themselves are dangerous beyond measure. Merely touching one could corrupt or kill the person attempting to destroy it. "But we know how to destroy them safely," Hermione said. "Basilisk venom, fiend fire, certain other methods. We learned through trial and error in our timeline." "Trial and error that nearly killed you multiple times," Harry added grimly. "But yes, we know what works." "Then we have a plan," Snape said, with the kind of quiet determination Harry had never heard from his former professor. "We hunt the Horcruxes, we destroy them, and we end Tom Riddle once and for all." "What about Peter?" Harry asked. "We still need the intelligence he might have about Voldemort's other plans." "I can find him," James said confidently. "If you can sense his emotional state, you can guide us to his location. And if he's genuinely seeking redemption, he'll cooperate." "And if he's not?" Hermione asked. "Then we use Veritaserum and take what we need," Lily said, with a hardness that reminded Harry powerfully of her son's own capacity for ruthless determination. They spent the rest of the morning planning in detail. Snape provided maps and intelligence reports. Dumbledore contributed tactical advice and magical theory. James and Lily offered strategic thinking, shaped by months of guerrilla warfare against Voldemort's forces. By lunchtime, they had a comprehensive plan for hunting 3 Horcruxes, locating Peter Pettigrew, and launching a coordinated assault on Voldemort's support network that would leave him isolated and vulnerable. "One question remains," Dumbledore said, as they prepared to separate and begin their individual preparations. "What happens after we succeed? When Voldemort is truly dead and the war is over? What then?" Harry looked around the room at the faces of people who had become his family, his allies, his chosen companions in an impossible war. "Then we live," he said simply. "We live the lives that were stolen from us, and we help others do the same." "And the timeline paradox?" Dumbledore pressed. "The questions about your continued existence here, the implications for the future you left behind." "Will sort themselves out," Harry replied with more confidence than he felt. "Some problems are too big to solve through planning. Sometimes you have to trust that doing the right thing will lead to right consequences." Dumbledore's smile was pleased and approving. Spoken like a true Gryffindor. "Very well. We move at dawn tomorrow. May fortune favor the foolish and the brave." As the meeting broke up and everyone began their preparations, Harry found himself alone in the kitchen with Hermione, both of them staring at the list of Horcrux locations and the magnitude of the task ahead. "Are we really going to do this?" Hermione asked quietly. "Hunt down pieces of Voldemort's soul and destroy them before he realizes what we're attempting?" "We're really going to do this," Harry confirmed. "Together. Like always." "Together," Hermione agreed, and Harry heard in her voice the same determination that had carried them through every impossible situation they'd ever faced. Outside the safe house, storm clouds were gathering on the horizon. But inside, in a kitchen warmed by friendship and purpose, 2 time-traveling teenagers and their adopted family planned to rewrite history, 1 Horcrux at a time. The war was far from over, but for the first time since arriving in 1981, Harry felt like they were finally fighting it on their own terms. Tomorrow, they would begin the hunt that would determine not just their own futures, but the fate of the entire wizarding world. Tonight, they would rest in the knowledge that they were no longer facing the darkness alone. And in the morning, they would discover whether love and courage and future knowledge were enough to triumph over the most dangerous dark wizard in history. The prophecy might be fulfilled differently than anyone had expected, but it would still be fulfilled. The gaunt shack squatted in the morning mist like a wounded animal, its rotting timbers and sagging roof a testament to decades of neglect and the corrosive influence of dark magic. Harry crouched behind a crumbling stone wall, watching Hermione perform detection charms while James and Sirius circled the perimeter, their wands tracing complex patterns in the air. "Definitely a Horcrux in there," Hermione whispered, her face pale with the strain of magical analysis. "The soul fragment is angry, restless, like it knows we're here." Marvolo Gaunt's ring, Harry said quietly, remembering the blackened, cursed thing that had nearly killed Dumbledore in their original timeline. Hidden under a floorboard, protected by curses that will try to kill anyone who touches it. The resurrection stone, Lily added, consulting the notes they'd compiled from Harry and Hermione's memories. One of the Deathly Hallows, corrupted into a vessel for a fragment of Voldemort's soul. The irony wasn't lost on any of them. Tom Riddle had turned an object meant to reunite people with their lost loved ones into an anchor preventing his own death, the exact opposite of its intended purpose. "Approach?" James asked, his voice carrying the crisp authority Harry remembered from the few glimpses he'd had of his father's leadership qualities. "Carefully," Dumbledore replied from his position near the shack's front door. "The curse on the ring is designed to be fatal within minutes of contact. However, if our intelligence is correct, the ring can be safely destroyed if we can avoid touching it directly." Severus emerged from the shadows where he'd been watching for Death Eater patrols, his black eyes reflecting the same grim determination they'd all developed over the past week of planning. "No sign of external watchers," he reported. "Whatever protections Voldemort has placed here, they're magical rather than human." Harry felt his scar prickle with familiar pain as they approached the shack. The sensation was different from what he remembered, less sharp, more diffuse, as if the connection between himself and Voldemort had been altered by the changes to the timeline. "The fragment in my scar is resonating with the one in the ring," he told the others. "They're aware of each other." "Can you sense anything specific?" Hermione asked, her analytical mind already working through the implications. "Pain, hatred, and—" Harry paused, trying to interpret the chaotic emotions bleeding through his mental shields. "Fear. The ring fragment is afraid of being destroyed." "Good," Lily said with quiet ferocity. "It should be." They entered the shack in formation, Dumbledore first to detect and neutralize curses, followed by Harry and Hermione with their knowledge of the ring's specific protections, then the others as backup. The interior was even more decrepit than the exterior suggested, filled with rotting furniture and the stench of dark magic that had been festering for decades. "There," Harry said, pointing to a loose floorboard near the far wall. "Under that board, in a small wooden box." James and Sirius worked together to lift the floorboard, using levitation charms rather than touching it directly. The box beneath was unremarkable. Plain wood, unadorned, the kind of container that might hold family heirlooms or old letters. "Such a mundane hiding place for something so evil," Severus observed. "That's what made it effective," Hermione replied, preparing the destruction ritual they'd planned. No one would think to look for a piece of the Dark Lord's soul in his grandfather's old jewelry box. The ring itself was exactly as Harry remembered, a heavy gold band set with a black stone engraved with the Peveril coat of arms. But seeing it in person, feeling the malevolent energy radiating from it, was far more disturbing than any memory. "It's beautiful," Lily said softly, and Harry heard the dangerous allure in her voice. "Don't look directly at it," Dumbledore warned sharply. "The resurrection stone calls to those who have lost loved ones, and we have all lost far too many people to resist its call safely." Harry understood completely. The temptation to use the stone, to bring back all the people who had died in the war, was almost overwhelming. But he'd learned the hard way that death was not meant to be undone, that the shadows called back by the stone were echoes of love rather than love itself. "Basilisk venom," Hermione said, pulling out a carefully preserved fang from the monster they'd killed in their second year. "One puncture should be enough to destroy the soul fragment." "Everyone stand back," James instructed. "If the Horcrux reacts violently to being destroyed—" Hermione positioned the basilisk fang over the ring, her hand steady, despite the magnitude of what they were attempting. "For everyone who died because Tom Riddle was too afraid of death to live properly," she said quietly, then drove the fang down into the ring's band. The reaction was immediate and horrifying. The ring screamed, not audibly, but magically, a psychic shriek that made everyone in the shack stumble and clutch their heads. Black smoke poured from the puncture wound in the gold, taking shapes that might have been faces or might have been nightmares. The wooden box caught fire, then crumbled to ash, then reformed and crumbled again as magic warred with itself. And through it all, Harry's scar blazed with pain so intense he thought his skull might crack. "Harry!" Lily's voice seemed to come from very far away, though he could feel her hands on his shoulders, trying to anchor him to the present. The pain lasted only seconds, but it felt like hours. When it finally faded, Harry found himself on his knees in the ruins of the shack, surrounded by his family and friends, staring at a ring that was now nothing more than molten gold and shattered stone. "One down," he managed to say, his voice hoarse from screaming. "5 to go," Hermione added grimly, though her eyes were bright with the satisfaction of a plan successfully executed. They apparated directly from Little Hangleton to Grimmauld Place, the ancient black family home that squatted in the heart of London like a malignant tumour. Harry had never been here in this timeline, but he recognized the oppressive atmosphere of generations of dark magic soaked into the very foundations. "Regulus hid the locket here after he stole it from the cave," Sirius explained as they stood before the imposing front door. "Before he was killed trying to destroy it. If it's still here, it'll be somewhere Mother couldn't find it to throw it away." The house felt different from Harry's memories of it in his 5th year, less abandoned, more actively hostile. The portrait of Mrs. Black was still hanging in the entrance hall, but she was younger, her screams of outrage at blood traitors and half-bloods more vigorous. "Lovely woman," James said dryly as they made their way upstairs to Regulus's old bedroom. "She gets worse with age," Sirius replied with grim humour. "Trust me." Regulus Black's bedroom was a shrine to Slytherin ambition and pure-blood ideology, green and silver everywhere, photographs of Quidditch teams and school friends, books on dark magic and blood purity stacked on every surface. But Harry could sense something else here too, something that spoke of doubt and growing horror and desperate courage. He was trying to get out, Harry realized, looking around the room with new understanding. Regulus was trying to find a way to leave Voldemort's service without getting his family killed. "And he found the locket," Hermione added, her detection charms leading them toward a loose stone in the fireplace. Tom Riddle's Horcrux. He must have realized what it was, understood the implications. The locket was hidden exactly where Harry remembered it being found in their original timeline, behind the loose stone, wrapped in a cloth that had once been fine, but was now rotted with age and dark magic. The serpent carved into its surface seemed to writhe in the lamplight, and Harry could hear faint whispers in Parseltongue, emanating from within. "It's trying to influence us," Lily observed, studying the locket with the detached interest of a scholar. "I can feel it pressing against my mental shields, looking for weaknesses to exploit." "Salazar Slytherin's locket," Dumbledore said, with something that might have been sadness. "One of Hogwarts's most precious artifacts, corrupted into an abomination. Tom always did have a talent for destroying beautiful things." This destruction was easier than the ring had been. They knew what to expect, and the locket was less heavily cursed. But the psychic scream when Hermione drove the basilisk fang through the serpent carving was no less horrible, and Harry's scar blazed with the same agonizing pain. "2 down," he gasped as the magical echoes faded. "And I'm starting to understand the pattern," Severus said thoughtfully. "Each time a Horcrux is destroyed, the remaining fragments become more agitated. They know they're being hunted." "Which means Voldemort knows too," James pointed out. "He may not understand exactly what's happening, but he'll sense the destruction of pieces of his soul." "Then we move faster," Lily said with determination. "We destroy them all before he can react effectively." The 3rd Horcrux required a return to Hogwarts, and infiltrating the school while it was in session presented unique challenges. They approached under cover of darkness, using a combination of disillusionment charms and Dumbledore's intimate knowledge of the castle's secret passages. "The Room of Requirement," Harry whispered, as they made their way through the 7th-floor corridor. Tom hid the diadem in there when he returned to apply for the Defense Against the Dark Arts position. "Among thousands of other hidden objects," Hermione added. "It could take hours to find, even knowing roughly where to look." But they had an advantage their original timeline counterparts hadn't possessed: Lily Potter's intuitive connection to protective magic and hidden things. As they paced past the stretch of blank wall, asking for a place where things were hidden, Lily pressed her hand to the stone and closed her eyes. "There," she said, with quiet certainty, when the door appeared. "The diadem is in the far northwest corner, hidden under a wig and an old cauldron." The Room of Hidden Things was exactly as Harry remembered it: a vast cavern filled with centuries of detritus, objects piled so high they formed mountains of forgotten treasures and discarded secrets. But Lily led them directly to the right location, her magical senses apparently attuned to the particular wrongness of a Horcrux. Rowena Ravenclaw's diadem was beautiful, even corrupted, a circle of silver set with sapphires, designed to enhance the wearer's wisdom. But the wisdom it offered now was poisonous, tainted with Tom Riddle's hunger for knowledge without understanding, power without responsibility. "For wit beyond measure is man's greatest treasure," Hermione quoted softly, reading the inscription that circled the diadem's band. "Tom never understood what that meant," Dumbledore observed sadly. "He saw wisdom as a tool for domination rather than enlightenment. No wonder the diadem became so twisted in his hands." The destruction followed the same pattern: basilisk venom, psychic screaming, Harry's scar exploding with pain. But this time something else happened as well. As the diadem crumbled to ash, Harry felt a lightness in his head he hadn't experienced in years, as if a weight he'd grown accustomed to carrying had suddenly been lifted. "The connection," he breathed, touching his scar with wonder. "It's weakening. Each Horcrux we destroy makes the fragment in my scar less stable." "Which creates both opportunity and danger," Dumbledore pointed out. "An unstable soul fragment is easier to remove, but also more likely to cause damage to its host." They made their way out of Hogwarts as carefully as they'd entered, but Harry could feel the difference in his magical signature. The constant low-level connection to Voldemort's thoughts and emotions was fading, replaced by something that felt like his own mind for the first time in his conscious memory. The infiltration of Gringotts required different tactics entirely. Rather than break in by force, they chose subtlety and misdirection, aided by intelligence Severus had gathered about Death Eater activities and Dumbledore's connections within the goblin community. "The goblins have no love for Voldemort," Dumbledore explained as they prepared for the most dangerous part of their mission. "His disregard for non-human magical beings has made him enemies among some of the most powerful financial institutions in the wizarding world. Their goblin contact was an elderly creature named Gornock, whose eyes held the kind of sharp intelligence that had made his species such successful bankers and warriors. He listened to their explanation with impassive attention, then surprised them all with his response. "We know of the cup," he said simply. "Hufflepuff's cup, hidden in the Lestrange vault. The magic around it is unnatural. Wrong. We have been wondering how to address the problem without violating our agreements with the wizard families." "And if we were to remove the cup?" James asked carefully. "Then we would be grateful to the thieves who solved our problem," Gornock replied, with what might have been a smile. "Particularly if those thieves were careful not to take anything else that did not belong to them. The heist itself was almost anticlimactic after all their planning. Gornock provided them with the necessary keys and passwords, and they found Helga Hufflepuff's cup exactly where Harry remembered it being, surrounded by treasure, but radiating the same malevolent energy as the other Horcruxes." "4 down," Hermione said with satisfaction, as they watched the cup dissolve under the basilisk venom's influence. 2 to go, Harry replied, though even as he said it, he felt something was different about the Count. The pain in his scar had lessened with each destruction, but there was still something there, some connection that hadn't been severed. 3 to go, Severus corrected quietly. You're forgetting the fragment in your own scar. Harry had been trying not to think about that particular problem. In their original timeline, the Scar Horcrux had been destroyed when Voldemort used Harry's blood to resurrect himself, creating a connection that allowed Harry to survive the killing curse once more. But in this timeline, things were different. We'll deal with that when we need to, Lily said firmly, her maternal instincts clearly rebelling against any plan that involved deliberately endangering her son. First, we finish hunting the ones we know about. Nagini, Harry said. The snake. But in this timeline, Voldemort might not have made her into a Horcrux yet. In our original time, she was one of the last he created. Then we find Voldemort himself, James said, with the kind of quiet determination that reminded Harry powerfully of his own moments of resolve. We end this properly, all at once. They spent the next 3 days gathering intelligence, calling in favors, and preparing for what they all knew would be the final confrontation. Severus provided updates on Voldemort's increasingly erratic behavior, his growing paranoia about the destruction of his Horcruxes. Order members reported sightings and rumors, building a picture of a Dark Lord who was becoming more dangerous as he became more desperate. He knows, Severus reported during their final planning session. He doesn't understand how or why, but he knows his anchors to life are being systematically destroyed. He's gathering his remaining followers, calling in every debt and alliance. Where? Harry asked. The same place he's been using for his most important rituals, Severus replied. The graveyard at Little Hangleton, Tom Riddle Sr.'s grave, where he completed his resurrection ritual in your original timeline. The circular nature of it appealed to Harry's sense of dramatic justice. Where Voldemort had once used his father's bones to restore his body, they would end his existence permanently. Tomorrow night, James decided, all of us together, we finish this. That evening, Harry sat in the garden of their safe house, watching the stars and trying to process everything that had happened since their arrival in 1981. Beside him, his infant self slept peacefully in Lily's arms, unaware that his older counterpart was preparing to risk everything to ensure he grew up in a world without Voldemort. Are you ready? Hermione asked, settling onto the bench beside them. As ready as anyone can be for something like this, Harry replied. You. Terrified, she admitted, but also hopeful. We've done the impossible already, Harry. We've saved your parents, destroyed most of Voldemort's Horcruxes, turned enemies into allies. What's one more miracle? Harry looked at his family, James arguing strategy with Sirius, Dumbledore reviewing protective spells with Remus, Severus maintaining a watchful perimeter, and felt something settle into peace in his chest. Whatever happens tomorrow, he said quietly, it's been worth it. All of it. The risks, the sacrifices, the uncertainty. Just to have this. To know what it feels like to have a family that loves me. You've always had that, Lily said gently, looking up from the sleeping baby. In every timeline, in every possible future, you've always been loved. But now I know it, Harry replied. Now I can feel it. That makes all the difference. As the evening wore on, they made their final preparations. Weapons were checked, spells were reviewed, contingency plans were established. But underneath the practical concerns, Harry sensed something deeper, the quiet confidence that came from knowing they were fighting not just for survival, but for the kind of future worth living in. Tomorrow, they would face Voldemort for the last time. Tonight, for the first time in his life, Harry Potter went to sleep surrounded by the people he loved most in the world. And for the first time since arriving in 1981, he didn't dream of green light or his parents' deaths. Instead, he dreamed of a world where children grew up safe and loved, where dark wizards remained buried in their graves, and where time-traveling teenagers got to keep the families they'd crossed impossible distances to save. It was a good dream. He hoped it would become reality. The graveyard at Little Hangleton waited in the darkness, like a mouth full of broken teeth. Harry stood at the edge of the ancient burial ground, his hand unconsciously moving to his scar as pain pulsed through it in waves. The connection to Voldemort was stronger here than it had been anywhere else, even weakened by the destruction of 4 Horcruxes. He could feel the Dark Lord's presence like a wound in the fabric of reality itself. "He's here," Harry said quietly, his voice carrying clearly in the still night air. Beside him, Hermione checked her wand one final time, her face set with the kind of determination that had carried them through every impossible situation they'd ever faced. "Are you ready for this?" "As ready as anyone can be to confront the darkest wizard in history," Harry replied, attempting humor that fell flat in the oppressive atmosphere. James moved up beside them, his presence radiating the same protective energy Harry remembered from the night of Voldemort's first attack. "Remember the plan. We work together, we protect each other, and we end this permanently." The plan was elegant in its simplicity. With 4 Horcruxes destroyed, Voldemort was mortal again, or as mortal as someone could be with remaining soul fragments anchoring him to life. But those remaining fragments were fewer and weaker, making him vulnerable in ways he'd never experienced before. "There," Lily whispered, pointing toward the center of the graveyard where a tall marble headstone rose above the others. Tom Riddle Sr.'s grave, the place where, in another timeline, Voldemort had used Harry's blood to restore his body. Tonight, it would be the place where Tom Riddle died for the final time. Voldemort stood beside his father's headstone like a dark mirror of grief. But there was nothing human in his posture. He was thinner than Harry remembered, his pale skin almost translucent, his red eyes burning with desperate fury. The destruction of his Horcruxes had clearly taken a toll. He looked less like an immortal Dark Lord and more like what he'd always been underneath, a terrified man running from death. "Harry Potter!" Voldemort called out, his voice carrying across the graveyard with unnatural clarity. The boy who lived, and his little friends who think they can play with time itself. They stepped forward as a group, Harry and Hermione flanked by James and Lily, with Sirius, Remus, Severus, and Dumbledore spread in a protective formation behind them, united, complete. Everything Voldemort had never understood about strength. "Tom," Harry replied, using the name deliberately. "You look different. Death suits you." Voldemort's face contorted with rage. "You know nothing of death, boy. But you will learn. Tonight, you will discover what happens to those who dare to interfere with Lord Voldemort's designs." "Your designs failed," Hermione said clearly. "Your Horcruxes are destroyed. Your followers are scattered. Your reign of terror is over." "My Horcruxes." Voldemort's red eyes flickered with something that might have been uncertainty. "Yes, I felt them die. Felt pieces of my soul torn away by magic I didn't recognize. Tell me, children, what makes you think you understand my magic better than I do?" "Because we've lived through the consequences of it," Harry replied. "We've seen what you become when you're allowed to succeed, and we've come back to make sure that future never happens." "Time travel." Voldemort's voice carried a note of grudging respect. "Impressive and foolish. Do you have any idea what you've risked by meddling with the temporal stream?" "Everything," Lily said simply. "We've risked everything to stop you." Voldemort laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "And what have you achieved? You've saved a few lives, destroyed a few anchors to mortality. But I remain. I endure. And now, weakened though I may be, I will destroy every one of you and restore what you have taken from me." He raised his wand, and Harry felt the air around them thicken with gathering dark magic. But something was different from their previous encounters. The magic felt hollow somehow, powerful but brittle, like a structure built on failing foundations. "Avada Kedavra!" Voldemort screamed, the green light erupting from his wand toward Harry. But Harry was no longer the frightened child who had faced this curse in a graveyard 4 years in the future. He was surrounded by family, protected by love freely given, anchored by connections that transcended time itself. "Protego!" James shouted, his shield charm blazing with golden light. The killing curse struck the protective barrier and shattered, its deadly magic dispersing harmlessly into the night air. Voldemort stared at his wand with the expression of a man whose most fundamental belief had just been proven wrong. "Impossible," he whispered. "Not impossible," Dumbledore said gently, stepping forward with his own wand raised. "Simply misunderstood. You have spent so long fearing death, Tom, that you never learned what makes life worth preserving." "Spare me your philosophy, old man," Voldemort snarled, but Harry could hear the uncertainty in his voice. "I am Lord Voldemort. I am immortal. I am—" "Afraid," Harry interrupted. "You're afraid. You've always been afraid. That's why you split your soul, why you hid pieces of yourself in objects, why you ran from death instead of accepting it as part of life. I fear nothing." Voldemort raised his wand again, but this time multiple voices shouted protective charms simultaneously. The combined magic of 8 powerful wizards created a barrier of light so bright it turned night to day. Voldemort's curse struck it and rebounded again, and this time Harry saw something crack in the Dark Lord's composure. "You cannot protect them forever," Voldemort said, but his voice had lost its commanding certainty. "I have magic you cannot imagine, power beyond your comprehension." "You have fear," Hermione corrected. "You have hatred and anger and desperation. But we have something you destroyed in yourself long ago." "And what is that, little girl?" "Love," Lily said simply. "We have love. For each other. For the people we're protecting. For the world we want to build. And that makes us stronger than you could ever be." Voldemort's response was a wordless shriek of rage and a barrage of curses that would have killed any one of them individually. But they weren't fighting individually. They were fighting as a family, as a unit, each person's magic strengthening the others. Harry found himself moving in perfect synchronization with Hermione, their spells weaving together as naturally as breathing. James and Lily flanked them, their protective magic creating an unbreachable barrier. Sirius and Remus provided tactical support, while Severus and Dumbledore worked to counter Voldemort's most dangerous attacks. It was everything Harry had ever dreamed of, fighting beside his parents, protected by friends, part of something larger than himself. "The scar," Hermione said suddenly during a brief lull in the magical combat. "Harry, I can see it. The Horcrux fragment in your scar. It's trying to escape." Harry pressed his hand to his forehead, feeling something writhe beneath the lightning bolt mark. "It hurts," he managed through gritted teeth. "Because it's dying," Dumbledore realized. "The love-based magic we're channeling is toxic to Horcrux fragments. The piece of Voldemort's soul in your scar is being slowly destroyed by our combined protective spells. Let it die," Harry said fiercely. "Let it burn away until there's nothing left." Voldemort must have sensed what was happening, because his attacks became more desperate, more vicious. He was no longer trying to win the battle through superior power. He was trying to kill Harry before the last piece of his soul was purged from the boy's scar. "Tom Riddle," a new voice called from the edge of the graveyard. They all turned to see Peter Pettigrew stumbling out of the darkness, his face haggard and his clothes torn, but his wand was steady in his hand, and his eyes held a determination Harry had never seen before. "Peter," Voldemort hissed, "my faithful servant returns." "I'm not your servant," Peter said clearly. "I never was. I was a coward who chose the wrong side because I was afraid to choose the right one. And now," Voldemort's voice carried deadly promise. "Now I choose differently," Peter replied. He looked at Harry, at James and Lily, at the friends he had betrayed, and who had nevertheless offered him a chance at redemption. "I choose love over fear. I choose courage over cowardice. I choose them over you." "Stupefy!" Peter shouted, his spell joining the protective magic surrounding Harry's group. The addition of Peter's magic, freely given in a moment of genuine redemption, created a resonance in the protective spells that none of them had expected. The golden light blazing around them intensified until it was painful to look at directly, and Harry felt the fragment in his scar begin to scream. Not audibly, magically. The dying piece of Voldemort's soul shrieked as it was consumed by love-based magic, torn away from Harry's mind and dissolved into nothingness. Harry felt the connection to Voldemort snap like a severed rope. For the first time in his conscious memory, his mind was completely his own. "No!" Voldemort screamed, clearly sensing the destruction of the soul fragment that had linked him to Harry. "You cannot! I am immortal! I am eternal! I am—" "Nothing," Harry said quietly, and his voice carried across the graveyard with absolute certainty. "You're nothing, Tom. You're a frightened child who broke his soul rather than face the fact that everyone dies eventually." Voldemort raised his wand for one final, desperate attack, but something had fundamentally changed in the magical balance of the confrontation. Without the Horcrux fragment in Harry's scar, without most of his other soul anchors, he was truly mortal for the first time in decades. And mortality, it turned out, made him vulnerable to the same love-based magic that had protected Harry from the very beginning. "Avada Kedavra!" Voldemort screamed. "Expelliarmus!" Harry shouted at exactly the same moment. The two spells met in midair, but this time there was no struggle for dominance, no golden thread connecting their wands. Harry's simple disarming charm, powered by the love of everyone around him, cut through Voldemort's killing curse like a sword through shadow. The green light died. Voldemort's wand flew from his hand, and the Dark Lord himself staggered backward, his red eyes wide with the first genuine fear Harry had ever seen in them. "This isn't possible," Voldemort whispered. "It's love," Lily said gently. "It's what I tried to tell you years ago, Tom. Love is the most powerful magic of all, and it's the one thing you can never understand or replicate." Voldemort fell to his knees beside his father's grave, his body already beginning to fade as his remaining soul fragments, weakened beyond recovery, lost their hold on life. I don't want to die. Everyone dies," Harry said, and his voice carried compassion along with finality. "That's what makes life precious. That's what you never learned." "Please," Voldemort whispered, looking up at Harry with something that might have been recognition. "Please, I don't want to be alone in the dark." Harry knelt beside the dying Dark Lord, ignoring the protests of everyone around him. "You won't be alone," he said quietly. "Death isn't an ending, Tom. It's just the next great adventure." Voldemort's eyes focused on Harry's face one last time. You really are Lily's son, aren't you? Even after everything I've done, you still have her mercy." "And my father's courage," Harry replied, "and my friend's loyalty, and my own choice to forgive you, even if I can never forget what you've done." Tom Riddle, for that's who he was in his final moments, not Lord Voldemort, but simply a frightened boy who had made terrible choices, nodded once. Then his eyes closed, his body stilled, and the most dangerous dark wizard in history finally found the peace that had eluded him for 70 years. The graveyard fell silent, except for the sound of their own breathing and the distant call of night birds. Harry remained kneeling beside Voldemort's body, feeling the weight of everything that had led to this moment. "Is it over?" Hermione asked quietly. Dumbledore moved to check Voldemort's body, his experienced hands searching for any sign of remaining magic, any indication that some fragment of the Dark Lord's soul might have survived. After several long minutes, he straightened and nodded. "It's over," he confirmed. "Tom Riddle is truly dead. No Horcruxes remain to anchor him to life. The war is ended." Harry felt something he hadn't experienced since childhood, the absence of fear. For the first time in his memory, he faced a future that wasn't overshadowed by the threat of Voldemort's return. "What happens now?" Peter asked, his voice small and uncertain. "Now we go home," James said simply. "We return to our lives and try to build the kind of world this war was fought to protect." "And Peter?" Harry asked, looking at the man who had betrayed his parents, but ultimately chosen redemption. "Peter will face the consequences of his choices," Dumbledore said carefully, "but he will also be credited with his role in Voldemort's final defeat. Justice tempered with mercy, as it should be." As they prepared to leave the graveyard, Harry took one last look at the body of Tom Riddle, the man who had shaped his entire life, who had killed his parents and marked him as the boy who lived, who had driven him to travel through time itself in desperate hope of changing everything. "Goodbye, Tom," Harry said quietly. "I'm sorry you never learned how to live." They disapparated from Little Hangleton as the sun began to rise, leaving behind only an empty graveyard and the peaceful body of a man who had finally found rest. The war was over. The future was theirs to build. And for the first time in his life, Harry Potter was truly free to be whoever he chose to be, surrounded by the family he had crossed time itself to save. The flight back to their safe house was quiet, each of them processing the magnitude of what they had accomplished. But as the familiar cottage came into sight, Harry felt something settle into peace in his chest. "We did it," Hermione said softly, her voice filled with wonder. "We actually did it." "We saved them all," Harry agreed, looking at his parents flying beside them, alive and whole, and his. "Every single person who died because of Voldemort in our original timeline. They get to live now." "Not just live," Lily called out, her voice carrying on the wind. "They get to thrive, to build families and chase dreams and experience all the joys that war stole from them." As they landed in the cottage garden, Harry was struck by how ordinary everything looked. The same flowers bloomed beside the path, the same curtains hung in the windows, the same warm light spilled from the kitchen where breakfast was probably waiting. But everything had changed. The world itself was different now, shaped by choices that had rippled backward through time to touch every life that had been affected by Voldemort's reign of terror. "What about us?" Hermione asked as they gathered in the kitchen. "What happens to two time-traveling teenagers who don't technically exist in this timeline?" "You exist wherever you choose to exist," Dumbledore said with gentle certainty. "Magic recognizes the validity of your presence here. You've earned your place in this world through sacrifice and love and sheer stubborn courage. Besides," Sirius added with a grin, "you're family now. Potters don't abandon family." Harry felt tears prick at his eyes. "Family," he repeated, tasting the word like something precious and new. "Always," James said firmly. "In every timeline, in every possible future, you will always have a place with us." As the morning wore on, they began the long process of adjusting to a world without Voldemort. Messages were sent to Order members, reports were filed with the Ministry, arrangements were made for Peter's trial and rehabilitation. But through it all, Harry found himself returning to the same simple truth. He had a family now, parents who loved him, friends who stood by him, a future that wasn't overshadowed by prophecy or destiny, or the need to save everyone else before himself. "What do you want to do first?" Lily asked, as they sat around the kitchen table, planning their new lives. "In this world where you can be anyone, do anything." Harry thought about it seriously. "I want to learn about my parents," he said finally. "Not from stories or memories or other people's photographs, but from you directly. I want to know what you were like as children, how you met, what made you fall in love, what dreams you had before the war." "We have time for that now," James said with satisfaction. "All the time in the world." "And I want to go to Hogwarts properly," Harry continued, "not as the boy who lived or a celebrity or someone special, just as Harry Potter, ordinary student, learning magic because it's wonderful, and not because I need it to fight dark wizards." "That can definitely be arranged," Dumbledore said with a smile. "Though I suspect you might find ordinary more challenging than you expect, given your extensive educational experiences." "What about you?" Harry asked Hermione. "What do you want from this new world?" Hermione was quiet for a long moment, her brilliant mind clearly working through possibilities. "I want to revolutionize the Department of Mysteries," she said finally. "I want to research time magic and temporal theory, and make sure no one ever has to make the kind of desperate choice we made." "And perhaps," Dumbledore suggested gently, "ensure that if they do need to make such a choice, they have better guidance than you did." "Exactly," Hermione agreed. "We learned so much through trial and error. Future time travelers shouldn't have to risk their lives just to figure out the basic principles." As the day progressed, Harry found himself repeatedly struck by the ordinariness of their new life. There were dishes to wash and laundry to fold, and a baby to care for. There were letters to write and friends to visit, and 100 small domestic tasks that had nothing to do with fighting dark wizards or saving the world. It was perfect. That evening, as Harry sat in the garden watching the stars emerge, his infant self sleeping peacefully in his arms, he thought about the dreams that had started everything, the cottage he'd never seen but somehow knew, the voices he couldn't remember, but that felt like home. Now he knew where the dreams had come from. They hadn't been nightmares of the past. They'd been visions of the future he was meant to have. The cottage where he'd grown up, loved and safe. The voices of parents who'd lived to raise him. The warmth of belonging that had been calling to him across time itself. "No regrets?" Hermione asked, settling beside him on the garden bench. "No regrets," Harry confirmed. "This is where we belong, Hermione. This is where we were always meant to be. Even knowing we can never go back, never see the Ron we knew, or the Weasleys from our timeline, or the world we left behind." Harry thought about that world, the one where he'd been famous and lonely and marked by tragedy. "I miss them," he said honestly. "I'll always miss them. But they're safe in their timeline, and we're safe in ours. And maybe that's how it was always supposed to be." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the stars and listening to the peaceful sounds of a village at rest. No dark magic disturbed the night. No desperate missions called them away from the simple pleasure of existing in the present moment. "Harry," Hermione said eventually, "thank you for including me in this impossible adventure, for trusting me with your family's lives, for giving me the chance to have a real family too." "Thank you for coming with me," Harry replied. "I couldn't have done any of this alone." "Good thing you didn't have to," she said with a smile. As the night deepened around them, Harry felt the last of his old fears and anxieties fade away. The boy who lived was gone, replaced by something better. Harry Potter, beloved son and trusted friend, living a life shaped by love instead of tragedy. The stars wheeled overhead, marking time in their ancient patterns. But time itself had been healed, the wounds in causality sealed by choices made from love rather than fear. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new joys. There would be a world to rebuild, relationships to nurture, dreams to chase, and hopes to fulfill. But tonight, surrounded by family and peace, and the quiet satisfaction of an impossible task completed, Harry Potter was exactly where he belonged. Home at last. 3 weeks after Voldemort's death, Harry woke to the sound of laughter drifting through his bedroom window. He lay still for a moment, processing the unfamiliarity of it. Not the laughter itself. That was becoming wonderfully routine. But the context. He was waking up in his own room, in his parents' house, to the sound of his father playing with his infant self in the garden below. It was everything he'd ever dreamed of, and yet it felt surreal enough that some mornings he still expected to wake up in his dormitory at Hogwarts, discovering it had all been an elaborate fantasy. "Harry!" Lily's voice called from downstairs. "Breakfast!" Another impossibility that had become routine. His mother calling him for meals, assuming he would be there to answer, including him in the casual rhythms of family life as if he'd always belonged. He dressed quickly and made his way downstairs, passing photographs that still took his breath away. His parents' wedding, their Hogwarts graduation, holidays with friends who were young and alive and unmarked by war. But now there were new pictures too, recent ones that showed the strange blended family they'd become. Harry and Hermione at the kitchen table, deep in conversation. James teaching both versions of his son to fly. Lily reading to the baby, while teenage Harry listened with the same rapt attention. "Morning," he said, settling into his usual chair at the breakfast table. "Morning, love," Lily replied, kissing the top of his head as she passed, a gesture so casual and maternal it still made his chest tight with wonder. "Your father's outside with little Harry. Apparently, today's the day he learns to ride a proper broomstick instead of his toy one." "At 10 months old?" Harry asked, though he was grinning. "You know your father," Lily said with fond exasperation. "He had you on a broom before you could walk the first time around, too." The first time around? They'd all developed casual ways of referring to the original timeline, acknowledging its reality while making clear their commitment to this one. It helped, Harry found, to think of his original life not as something lost, but as something that had led him here. Hermione appeared in the doorway, looking more rested than she had in months. The constant time loop fatigue had finally faded, leaving her with energy for pursuits beyond mere survival. "Any word from the Ministry?" Harry asked as she settled beside him. "Peter's trial is set for next week," Hermione reported, consulting the official owl post they'd received. "Full Wizengamot hearing. Dumbledore says they're treating it as both a war crimes tribunal and a redemption hearing." It was a uniquely complex legal situation. Peter Pettigrew had undeniably betrayed James and Lily to Voldemort, an act of treason that would normally warrant a life sentence in Azkaban. But he'd also ultimately turned against the Dark Lord, playing a crucial role in Voldemort's final defeat. The wizarding legal system had never quite figured out how to handle such moral complexity. "What's the likely outcome?" Harry asked, though he'd been following the case closely. "House arrest and community service. Probably," Hermione replied. "Supervised magical rehabilitation. He'll never be fully free, but he won't be sent to Azkaban either." "Good," Harry said, and meant it. Peter's moment of courage in the graveyard had been real, his choice to stand with them genuine. That had to count for something. James came through the kitchen door carrying baby Harry, both of them dishevelled from their morning flying lesson. The infant was giggling and reaching for his father's glasses, while James wore the expression of a man completely besotted with fatherhood. "How did it go?" Lily asked, taking the baby and checking him over for injuries with practiced maternal efficiency. "He's a natural," James said proudly. "Barely 10 months old and already trying to do barrel rolls. Definitely gets his flying instincts from the Potter side of the family." "His recklessness, you mean?" Lily corrected dryly, but she was smiling. Harry watched the exchange with the fascination of someone observing a world he'd never expected to see. His parents as young adults, still figuring out how to be married and raise a child, still learning each other's quirks and habits. It was intimate in a way that made him feel both included and slightly voyeuristic. "Speaking of family," James said, settling into his chair, "we've had an owl from Sirius. He's finally moving out of Grimmauld Place." "About time," Hermione observed. "That house was never healthy for him." It was true. Sirius had spent the weeks since Voldemort's defeat wrestling with the reality of his freedom, not just from the war, but from the expectations and limitations that had shaped his entire life. In the original timeline, he'd been imprisoned in Azkaban and then trapped by circumstances and guilt. Here, he was simply a young man trying to figure out who he wanted to be when he wasn't defined by conflict. "Where's he going?" Harry asked. He's bought a place near Hogsmeade, James replied. Says he wants to be close enough to visit, but far enough away to have his own life. I think he's been spending time with that healer from St. Mungo's, the one who worked on our protection ward research. Harry filed that information away with quiet satisfaction. In their original timeline, Sirius had never had the chance for romance or normalcy. Here, he could explore possibilities that war had previously made impossible. "What about Remus?" Hermione asked. "Any word from him?" Lily's expression grew warm. "He's teaching at a primary school in Wales. Muggle school, using his real name and everything. Apparently the headmistress there is quite taken with him." Another impossibility made real. Remus Lupin, who'd spent their original timeline struggling with unemployment and self-hatred, was now simply a well-liked teacher, with a steady job and a potential romantic interest. The absence of war had allowed him to build the kind of normal life his lycanthropy had always complicated, but never truly prevented. "I'm glad," Harry said simply. "He deserves happiness." "They all do," James replied. "Every person who survived this time around, every family that stayed intact, they all deserve the chance to live without fear." It was something they'd discussed extensively in the weeks following Voldemort's defeat. The ripple effects of their intervention had touched every aspect of the wizarding world. Families who'd lost members to the war were now whole. Children who'd grown up as orphans now had parents. The Longbottoms, who'd been tortured to insanity in the original timeline, were now simply a happy family with a young son named Neville. "Have you heard anything about the Weasleys?" Harry asked, trying to keep his voice casual. Hermione gave him a knowing look. The Weasley family held special significance for both of them. They'd been more than friends in the original timeline, more like additional family. Harry worried about how their absence might have affected the family dynamics, whether the Weasleys were better or worse off in this version of events. "Arthur's been promoted at the Ministry," Lily reported. Something about his work on protective ward legislation being particularly valuable after the war. Molly's pregnant again. Another boy due in the spring. Harry felt a complex mix of emotions at that news. Another Weasley child, one who wouldn't exist in their original timeline. A life created by their intervention, as real and valuable as any other. "And the older children," Hermione pressed. "Bill's still working with Gringotts. Charlie's in Romania with his dragons. Percy's apparently top of his year at Hogwarts." James paused, consulting the letter he'd received from Arthur. "The twins are 11 now. They'll be starting at Hogwarts next year. And Ron," he smiled. "Ron's 9 years old and already showing signs of being a powerful wizard. Arthur says he's got a particular talent for strategic thinking." Ron. Harry closed his eyes for a moment, remembering his best friend's loyalty and courage and terrible jokes. This Ron would be different, raised without the shadow of war, without the insecurity that had sometimes plagued him, without the specific experiences that had forged their friendship. But he would still be Ron Weasley, and Harry found himself looking forward to meeting him again, even if the boy wouldn't remember their previous friendship. "We should visit them," Harry said impulsively. "The Weasleys. I'd like to see how they're doing." "I think that's a lovely idea," Lily said warmly. "Arthur and Molly are good people, and it might be nice for you to meet children your own age who aren't dealing with the aftermath of time travel." It was a gentle reminder of one of the challenges they'd been grappling with. Harry and Hermione were 13 years old chronologically, but they'd lived through experiences that had aged them far beyond their years. Making friends with their temporal peers felt awkward when those peers were concerned with homework and Quidditch, while Harry and Hermione were processing the emotional aftermath of systematic magical warfare. "What about Severus?" Hermione asked, changing the subject to another person whose life had been dramatically altered by their intervention. James's expression grew thoughtful. "He's struggling, I think. He's free from Voldemort's service, free from the guilt of being responsible for the prophecy that led to Lily's death. But he doesn't quite know what to do with that freedom. He's been avoiding me," Lily added quietly. I think seeing me alive and happy makes it harder for him to process his own feelings about the past. It made sense, Harry thought. Severus Snape's entire adult identity in their original timeline had been built around guilt and penance for his role in Lily's death. Here, where she lived and thrived and loved her family, he had to confront the reality that his grand gesture of redemption was unnecessary. It was a psychologically complex situation. He needs time. Dumbledore's voice came from the kitchen doorway, where the headmaster stood with his usual impeccable timing. Albus, Lily said warmly, rising to greet him. We weren't expecting you. I hope you don't mind the intrusion, Dumbledore replied, his blue eyes twinkling with familiar warmth. I have news that I thought you'd want to hear immediately. They gathered around the kitchen table, baby Harry gurgling contentedly in his mother's arms, while the adults waited for Dumbledore's announcement. The Ministry has completed its investigation into the events of the past several weeks, Dumbledore began. Officially, the records will show that Voldemort was defeated by a coordinated effort of Order of the Phoenix members, led by James and Lily Potter, with crucial assistance from several other individuals whose identities are being kept confidential for security reasons. No mention of time travel, Harry said with relief. No mention of time travel, Dumbledore confirmed. As far as the wizarding world knows, you and Miss Granger are simply two remarkably talented young people who happened to be in the right place at the right time to provide assistance. What about our legal status? Hermione asked. Birth records, citizenship, the right to exist in this timeline? Dumbledore's smile was particularly pleased. I'm happy to report that the Ministry's Department of Mysteries has concluded that certain irregularities in your documentation are the result of wartime record-keeping errors rather than anything more exotic. You are both now officially citizens of magical Britain with full rights and recognition. Harry felt a weight he hadn't realized he was carrying lift from his shoulders. The fear of being discovered, of having their intervention exposed and themselves punished or expelled from the timeline, had been a constant background anxiety. So we can stay, he said. Officially. You can stay officially, Dumbledore confirmed, though I suspect you'd already made that decision, regardless of legal technicalities. It was true. Harry had known from the moment he'd held his parents in the cottage garden that he couldn't leave this timeline. The life he'd found here, family, belonging, the simple right to exist without fame or destiny or prophecy, was worth any risk. What about Hogwarts? Hermione asked. Will we be able to attend school normally? I see no reason why not, Dumbledore replied, though I suspect you'll find the curriculum rather elementary, given your extensive practical education. Harry and Hermione exchanged glances. They'd discussed this concern extensively, having learned magic through life-or-death situations and desperate necessity. Sitting through first-year transfiguration lessons was likely to be excruciating. We could test out of some subjects, Hermione suggested.